Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I have a special treat for you guys. So I'm continuing on with my Shroud Wars series, but this time it's a little bit different. We're not going to have a pro-Shroud guy versus a Shroud skeptic as we've done in the past. This time we're bringing two pro-Shroud experts together to discuss, a couple of issues related to the Shroud image formation as well as the carbon-14 dating. So in the first place, my first guest is someone who's been on the show is Joe Marino. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Yeah, Joe's got a new book coming out on the carbon-14, and that was sort of the impetus to put this together. I'll turn it to him and let him introduce it in a couple seconds. But our other guest here is another person who's not a stranger to the show, Bob Rucker. Hey, Bob.
Hello.
Excellent. Welcome back. And he's got a slightly different take on the carbon-14. So we're going to be discussing those issues here. So yeah, just by way of introduction, first and foremost, I'll start with you, Bob. What have you been up to since you've last been on the show?
Well, I'm continuing to work on the Shroud of Turin, resolving some issues with my papers, updating them a bit, and trying to keep up with my reading schedule here. It's very hard when you just received an 800-page book by Joe Marino. So, but I'm also trying to get into research at this point, and we have several different research projects that we're moving into at this point.
Awesome. All right. And Joe, yeah, just before you begin your opening speech there, just out of curiosity, as you said, you've got a new book out. Did you want to take a few moments to just update the audience on what you've been up to there?
Yeah, actually, this is my second book this year. In May, I think it was, I came out with a revised and updated version of my first book, which was published in 2011, wrapped up in the Shroud Chronicle of a Passion. And I revised and updated that, and it came out in May. And then I attended the Ancaster conference in Canada last year and presented a paper on the reweave. And an acquaintance of mine somewhere along the line suggested to me that I write a book on the C14 fiasco. And in 2016, I had written a 3-part 175-page article that's on Barry Schwartz's website. And so I had 175 pages already in place, so I decided to expand that. And first I thought it was going to be 500, and then it turned out to be 600, and then 700, and the final copy was 800 pages. And it's available on Amazon. You can find it by doing a search on Shroud of Turin books or by my name, Joseph G. Marino, and it'll come up. And it was quite an exercise. I've been collecting material for it for about 32 years, and I just felt like this book had to be written, and I'm glad my acquaintance kind of gave me that little impetus to expand that 175-page article. And I did it in print only because I figured, 175 pages alone online is hard enough to read, but 800 is almost impossible. So I decided to do it in print. And one little bonus is that if people buy the book, and if they'd like a PDF of the book, I'll send it to them. That way, the big advantage of that is that if there's a URL in the book that you want to check, you'd have to manually type it in from just the book. But if you have the PDF, you can copy and paste, and that'll save some typing. But I think it's an important book, and I arranged to have a copy sent to the Pope, and I'm sure he won't drop everything and read it right away, but I'm hoping he realizes that there's more to the question than possibly he was previously led to believe.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll probably ask for a PDF, and I know at least one listener, Teddy, super fan of the Shroud. She'll probably be wanting a copy of the PDF as well. So, yeah, maybe if you send it to me, I could put it as an
Sure.
attachment. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes,
Awesome.
yes, I would like to congratulate Joe for this. I think it's a tremendous work here to put all of this information together. So congratulations on your achievement here.
Thank you.
Awesome. So yeah, with that said, let's stop beating around the bush. I want to turn it. Our first topic is going to be basically Joe's hypothesis. You know, what is in this book of his that he's been writing about the carbon-14. So yeah, Joe, you've go ahead and give your opening presentation about your theory on the how to explain the carbon-14.
Okay. Well, just as for any listener that you know is not familiar with the whole story, of course, in 1978, the Shroud of Turin research project performed multidisciplinary tests on the shroud and concluded that the image was not the product of an artist. They had not done a carbon-14 test in that particular round of testing because it would have required too big of a piece. So it was actually in the year before their testing in '77 that the AMS method of carbon dating, which requires much smaller samples than the previous proportional counter method, was invented. And so in 1988, a test was performed, and it was given a sample from one area on the cloth was given to 3 different labs: Oxford in England, Zurich in Switzerland, and Arizona in the United States. And that test was actually supposed to have been done in a multidisciplinary context as like the 78 tests were, but there were a lot of politics, which I lay out in the book and stuff. And this is an interesting fact. One of the things I point out in the book is that the Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI, actually okayed 2 weeks of testing, 2 weeks for STIRP to perform multidisciplinary tests. And somehow somebody or some entity or some group somehow were able to go over his head, get those tests eliminated, get STIRP eliminated, and have only the C14 test performed. And, you know, the labs were very interested in promoting this new AMS method. And they really believed that, you know, carbon-14 was more important than all the other tests combined. And unfortunately, the church let them do that. And they came out with dates of 1260 to 1390, which of course is much too late if it was to be the burial cloth of Jesus. But there have been numerous problems with the protocols and the background of the testing, all of which I lay out in the book in excruciating detail. But early on, several people right away, one of the big explanations some people had for why the C14 came out medieval was that that the shroud might have been repaired. And I saw that theory thrown around quite a bit, including by Bill Meacham, an archaeologist who's he's an American, but he's been in Hong Kong for several decades. And there was a Swiss archaeologist named Maria Grazia Ciliato, and she pushed that theory a bit.
Joe, sorry to interrupt. Just so you know, like, are you moving the slides or? Okay,
not yet. This is just all background. So I've only got eight other slides, which I'll put up as I get to the particular point. I'm just trying to give some background here.
Gotcha. Sorry. Okay.
So my late wife, Sue Benford, and I started looking more seriously into the idea that the shroud could have been repaired. And so we started doing research on techniques of medieval repair. We showed some pictures of the C14 corner to various textile experts and did not tell them that they were looking at the shroud. And it was interesting. I later found like 3 manuals on invisible reweaving. And one of the manuals, it's called the Friendway manual, said it was, the technique was so kind of not well known that they said all but a few people in the world were in ignorance of the techniques involved. And they say, the manual says, if you do your work well, very few people will ever be able to detect what you've done. So Paul Maloney, who's another archaeologist that gave credence to the theory, he looked into French reweaving as well. And he says the most significant feature is that it uses no knots and therefore would not likely show up clearly on x-rays unless they knew what they were looking for. So one of the pictures we gave to the textile expert was to an elderly tailor in Columbus, Ohio, where Sue and I lived. And he said he was trained in Europe with the weaving and that the various techniques. And he didn't know he was looking at the shroud. And he said that, oh yeah, he says there's a patch here. In other words, there were some repairs. And then we brought it to several other textile experts, and 2 other independent experts said that they detected repairs as well. So when that happened, we knew we might have been on the right track, that since 3 independent textile experts independently were saying that there were repairs. So we started looking into it, and found out that Margaret of Austria, who owned the shroud in the 1530s, and she had access to the best weavers in Europe. And we found a textile expert named Thomas Campbell who said that 16th century weavers were magicians, and they could do marvelous things on tapestries. So we started looking into the documentation, and we found that there was something called the Turin Commission in 1969 and 1973. They were mostly, I think, all Italian experts, actually. And we found a quote. They came out with a proceedings that came out in 1976. And we found that one of the commission members, a guy by the name of Enzo Di Lorenzi, said in his paper that he had the impression from his examination that many repairs had been carried out that had been actually documented in the historical records. So we were starting to get more and more clues that lots of repairs had been done. And then we found that Gilbert Reyes was given, he's a Belgian textile expert. He was given a small sample, and he wrote in his report, which was also in the Turin Commission proceedings, that he had found cotton. And of course, the shroud is linen, so there shouldn't be cotton in the shroud. But if there's a repair there, that would explain the cotton, because cotton blend, you could dye cotton more easily than linen. So, and then along the way, Mechtild Fleury Lemberg, who will come into the picture, and Bob will mention her as well. She said the shroud stitching that she noticed is possibly from the same period as a cloth from Masada in Israel, which was dated to like BC 40 to AD 74. So that the date of Jesus' crucifixion, which is thought to be 30 or 33, is right in that range. So in 1984, 4 years before the carbon dating, Stirk put together a 26 test work package, which included carbon-14, which, as I said, unfortunately wasn't, the other multidisciplinary tests weren't allowed. But they had a section in their work package, and that's available online now. They had a section called Old Men's, and I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but they acknowledge that they're talking about mending threads and damage, repairs, some crude repairs they mentioned. So the Turin authorities should have realized that repairs were a factor, and they should have been much more careful on where the sample was taken. But they were very cavalier about it. Basically, they ended up taking it from next to the Reyes sample because that area had already been, excised for the Reyes sample, and they thought, well, that area is already cut on, so we'll cut from that area. But that was a bad decision because that area was handled the most, and then there were a lot of repairs, and it's likely that there were repairs to keep it from further unraveling. And during the 1986 planning meeting in Turin, where they planned for the 88 testing, even Harry Gove felt that there should be a textile expert present because he wanted to make sure that they were getting cloth from the main body of the shroud and not a rewoven area. So I found some recent articles and things that from around the 1986 period, same time, 2 years before the dating, where several Italian authors mention foreign threads and patches and things. And after Rigi took the sample in 1988, he wrote in a book that was published in Italian, and there is an unpublished English version, which I have a copy of. And he said he says, I was authorized to cut approximately 8 square centimeters of cloth from the shroud from the same place that provided taken in 1973 by Professor Reyes. This was then reduced to about 7 centimeters because fibers of other origins had become mixed up with the original fabric and could have led to erroneous readings in the dating experiment. So that was a pretty significant quote. And then he also talked about how when the shroud was exhibited for public expositions, a pole was inserted in the side from which the C14 sample was taken. And he said, this wear and tear made major repairs necessary, which still can be seen today in the upper corners, both left and right. Repairs which required the addition of new fabric by skilled seamstresses to reinforce the shreds of the material from the original. And then he goes on further to talk about a different color of the thread. It cannot be detected with the naked eye. So we have some high-powered people here talking about repairs and patches and apparent reweaving So then after Oxford got their sample, Teddy Hall of the lab noticed some fibers that looked out of place, and he sent it to a lab in Derbyshire, and they determined that the rogue fibers were cotton of a fine dark yellow strand. And Peter South of the lab there says it may have been used for repairs at some time in the past. And then in 1989, there was a symposium in Paris with which Gilbert Reyes said that in the 1988 Oxford sample he looked at, the cotton he observed was contained inside the threads. And that could explain the fact that there seemed to be a difference in fiber diameters. And then Bill Meacham, the archaeologist from Hong Kong, came out with a press release, and he quoted a Dr. Stuart Fleming. Fleming said that a supposed restorer could certainly have rewoven a damaged edge to a standard not visible to the naked eye. And then also at the Paris conference, Jacques Gavin, who was he was a French C14 scientist that was involved in the dating, was asked about the possibility of a reweave. And he said at the conference, and I've got this on videotape, he says, "I quite agree that the labs did not take the weaving techniques into account, and they did not date the threads per se. Thus, if the weave was rewoven with threads from modern restoration, this would be reflected in more modern results." So, you know, we were getting a lot of indications that the repair seemed to be the answer. And then a Belgian chemist, Remy van Hels, did some statistical analysis and said that the chi-square test, which determines homogeneity of samples, he said the value should be less than 6, and for the shroud it was 6.4, meaning that the subsamples can't be considered from the same representative sample. Moving ahead to 1996, the late Al Adler of Stirp said in a paper, you have no way of knowing if the area you took the C14 sample from represents the whole cloth. That's an area which has obviously been repaired. There's cloth missing there. It's been rewoven on the edge. They even cut part of it off because it was obviously rewoven on the edge. The simplest explanation why the date may be off is that it's rewoven cloth there, and that's not been tested. In 1993, he wasn't aware of the findings that Marie Grazia Ciliazzo had presented at Rome, a Rome conference in 1993, where she said there's all sorts of different types of repairs: tacking, hemming, whipping, stringing, and mending stitches, and many others. And so she actually talked about an invisible mending technique. And I started, you know, finding, I had all this stuff in my literature, and once I started going back and reading some of that, I realized there was a lot more detail about possible repairs that hadn't stuck with me when I had originally read it when that material first came out. So here's an analysis of, or a depiction of some of the different types of repairs. And I do think that there's probably more than just the invisible reweave technique involved. I think multiple types of techniques were probably involved. So, and Ciliato said, What emerges is the proof that the sample was irregularly loaded with foreign, undetermined textile material. In other words, many threads were added for its mending with various techniques in different, much later ages. And of course, if there are cotton fibers in the C14 area, you would expect to find chemical differences, which I think is a key point, because we tend to emphasize visual inspection, but I think you also have to look at the chemical evidence. And Adler in 96 in another paper said that he noticed differences in chemical composition, and he stated in particular the radiocarbon samples are not representative of the non-image samples that comprise the bulk of the cloth. So in 96, two Italian researchers, Petrosillo and Marinelli, wrote in their book that it's not excluded that the corner could have been repaired in a way that is invisible to the naked eye, something which the expert restorers of the medieval times knew how to do extremely well. Flax, cotton, or threads of a type not distinguishable from the original ones of the shroud could have been used. So there's probably a blend of cotton and linen, and that could explain the difference in differing weights of the samples. And then they also mentioned it's well known that there was a secret C14 test done in 1982 of one of the raised sample threads, and they said that during the pre-treatment, the presence of starch was noted, that it could have been used for the dressing of the cloth by a medieval restorer. It was commonly used for invisible mending. So in 1998, Piero Savarino, who later became the scientific advisor to Cardinal Poletto, he wrote in a booklet that the 1988 C14 testing might have been erroneous due to extraneous thread left over from invisible mending routinely carried out in the past on parts of the cloth in poor repair. And then he said, if the sample taken had been the subject of invisible mending, the carbon dating results would not be reliable. What is more, the site from which the samples actually were taken does not preclude this hypothesis. So as I mentioned, we then in around 2000, we took our photographs to 3 labs that all independently, not knowing that it was shroud photographs, said there were repairs there. So in 2000, we presented our paper in Orvieto, Italy, and Barry Schwartz was in attendance and came up to us right away and asked us if we would have our paper published on our site. We said sure. So he published it, and then the late Ray Rogers saw it and then called Barry up and was not pleased with Barry for having published it, because Ray just outright said that Sue and I were part of the lunatic fringe, and he said I could prove those folks wrong in 5 minutes. And Barry said, well, go for it, because Ray had some leftover samples from the main part of the cloth from his 1978 study, and he also had threads, some of the Reyes samples, which was right next to the C14 sample. So he said, I can prove him wrong in 5 minutes. He would compare the two and see that they were the same, and thus disprove the theory. So Barry said that Ray called him back in about an hour and a half, and he said, I can't believe it. I think they're right. So, you know, we have some high-powered Adler, Rogers, some high-powered people pointing toward a repair. And Adler wrote some more, and unfortunately he died in mid 2000, but right before he died, one of his papers came out. He attended a conference in Turin in March and died in June. And in the proceedings, he says the nature and or extent of the repairs undertaken here are also unknown. Therefore, the possibility exists that the selvage edge might be linen not original to the shroud. The selection of this single suspicious sample site is a sufficient reason to doubt the accuracy of the radio date. So Rogers continued to do study and wrote some articles, and basically said that he found starch and gum and a linen cotton splice, and I found recently another textile expert, Piero Vercelli, who just died within the last year. He wrote something in 2002 saying the sample examined appears to have been manipulated in the most frayed area where the threads have thinned out by sliding over the wefts. And then in 2003, some additional information was published about the quad mosaics, which Stirp took in 1978. Of course, it wasn't with reference to the any C14 test, but you can see in the picture here the green, how green that corner is from where the sample was taken compared to the rest of the cloth. And differences in color indicate different chemical compositions. And the fact that that is so green compared to the rest of the cloth suggests chemical differences, and that it's definitely different than the main part of the cloth. So in 2005, Rogers published a paper in Thermochimica Acta, January 2005. And unfortunately, he died 2 months after that. And it was a pretty significant paper. He talked about the presence of aliresin dye and red lakes in the RAS and radiocarbon samples indicate that the color has been manipulated. Specifically, the color and distribution of the coating implies that repairs were made at an unknown time when foreign linen dyed to match the older original material. The radiocarbon sampling area is uniquely coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing dye lakes. Pyrolysis mass spectrometry results from the sample area coupled with microscopic and microchemical observations prove that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. And Ray was very particular about when and how you could use the word prove, because he always told Barry, you know, when Barry would use the word prove, he says, you can't say prove, but in this case, Ray said that it proves that it was not part of the original cloth. And the people in Italy at first kind of fought back a bit against Ray's conclusion, and they kind of backtracked a little bit and said, yeah, they kind of said we have to be open-minded about it. And then Ray wasn't satisfied with just his own analysis, so he sent some of his samples to a microscopist named John Brown in Georgia. And you know, Rogers had found an incrustation of plant gum on the outside of the C14 sample, and he did the chemical and microscopic analysis that showed embedded madder root dye. So he checked with John Brown, who was a microscopist, and Brown believed that the area had been rewoven, and that dye was applied in an attempt to match the color of the shroud. And he removed warp threads from the weft threads, revealing some undyed areas. And he said that the undyed areas did not fluoresce like the dyed areas did. And in both the Reyes samples and the C14 samples, cotton fibers were found interwoven with the linen. And so apart from some surface cotton fibers from the stirp members, gloves, no cotton was found anywhere else on the shroud. And John Brown has many micro photographs, which I have in my Ancaster paper from Canada in 2019, which is available on Academia. They found the gum and dye particle incrustations were found on the outer surface of many of the fibers. Also in 2005, the late, I keep on saying the late so-and-so, there's so many of the great researchers that are now gone, but the late Alan Wanger gave a paper in Dallas in 2005. And he said, on studying the radiographs of the shroud made in 1978, details of the seams and threads can be seen. It appears that the side seam was put in as a tuck, and that near the two missing corners there are variations in weave patterns and in thread densities, which suggest that these two areas had been damaged and then repaired in some way. Examination of the site of the C14 single sample indicates that at least part of the sample was taken from one of these repaired or altered areas. 2007, we found a website called Without a Trace. Michael Ehrlich in Chicago does invisible mending services. And he said French weaving involves a tedious thread by thread restoration that is indeed invisible. And, you know, the owners of the shroud in Margaret of Austria, they had the time and the resources and the ability of their weavers to do such a technique. 2008, a Los Alamos chemist named Bob Villarreal, he's also deceased now, he confirmed Rogers' finding of a splice, and he enlisted the help of 8 other Los Alamos, I'll show that there's a photomicrograph that Bob Villarreal put out. And Bob got like 8 other scientists at Los Alamos to help with the analysis. And they did quite a bit of research. Here's the listing of the different tests that they did. I'm not going to read those off. You can take a look at that on the screen. And one of those 8 scientists, Dr. John Schoonover, gave a presentation to a group in St. Louis in 2009. And the group's conclusion was, thread is suspected to be from region of shroud repair. Bob Villarreal presented a paper in Spain in 2012, updating some of the information. And then Paul Maloney in 2008. I remember before I said Reyes had said that the sample he examined from Oxford in 2008, he believed, or 1988 rather, he believed that the cotton was inside the fibers. And this is a list that Paul presented at a paper in Columbus in 2008, where of those who found cotton inside of the fibers, which points to a reweave. Gilbert Reyes, Sturp's 1981 analyses, they didn't realize it at the time, the significance of that. A lab in England in 1988, Ray Rogers' own investigations, John Brown at Georgia Tech, and then the findings by Villarreal and their team in 2008. And then Maloney also laid out all the various components based on Rogers' research that seemed to indicate a repair. So we have the linen cotton spun yarn spliced into the shroud cloth, which showed a coating of starch and aluminum mordant and other metallic salts, gum Arabic binder, and madder rose dye. So also in 2008 in Columbus, Sue and I presented a paper that was based on a paper that was published in a peer-reviewed chemistry journal from Italy called Chemistry Today, and we addressed the question of whether an invisible reweave could be seen on the backside, and we found evidence that it can be done. It's not easy to do, but it can be done. So we also have a physician from France named Thibaut Heimberger who looked at some of the Reyes threads, and he says, I can confirm with absolute certainty that there are cotton fibers in the thread. Ray Rogers was absolutely right. And he says, Reyes thread number 7 is definitely a thread intentionally spun with linen and cotton. Now in 2010, Timothy Joel came out. He is from one of the scientists from Arizona. He came out saying that they had examined one of their leftover samples and that there was no indication that there was a repair there. But he did admit there were cotton fibers there. But I wouldn't expect them to conclude that it was a repaired sample, even though he admitted it was cotton. It's like, you think it in 30 years later they're going to admit that they made a mistake. So I don't put much stock in that. 2012, John Morgan of the Geospatial Research and Education Laboratory at Towson University wrote a highly technical paper detailing the analysis of an ultraviolet shroud photo, and he concluded that there's evidence of cotton in the C14 sampling area. Barry Schwartz, the shroud documenting photographer, sent a picture to the Shroud Science Group, which is a private group on the internet. It was a transmitted light image of the C14 corner, and he said that there seemed to be a darker area to the right of the seam that could be interpreted as a positive indication of manipulation. And he went on to talk about the difference in the color of that corner, as I mentioned in the quad mosaics before. In 2014, a book came out in English, an English translation of a book in Spanish. It was by the Savoy family archivist named Carlos Evaristo. And of course, the Savoy family owned the shroud up until 1983. and he died and willed the shroud to the living Pope. And in the book, Evaristo said the section could have been rewoven back onto the original hole, or else the section in question was substituted with another piece of similar cloth. And then he also said another fact confirmed by His Majesty was that it was traditionally affirmed that at one point in the past, the edges of the sheet had become so tattered as to cause embarrassment or criticism of the custodians, and those areas were repaired and rewoven using identical techniques, but obviously with similar yet newer materials containing dyes and other medieval manufacturing ingredients in an attempt to better blend the new sections in as best as possible with the original fabric. So here we have the Savoy family archivist asserting that King Umberto, who owned the shroud, had stated that the C14 sample area had repair fibers added to it. By the way, I'm going to be presenting an updated version of my reweave paper at a conference in Washington, D.C. that's going to be held, assuming the COVID virus doesn't jettison it, in late July. When I gave the paper an Ancaster, I think I had, slightly over 100 slides. But I have found some more recent material, some of which I've mentioned here today. So there's a textile expert named Donna Campbell, who's from Thomas Ferguson Limited in the UK, and they were one of the three groups that we sent Sue and I had sent the photographs to in 2000. And she did some analysis of study of the photographs, and she said in a paper that's on the internet, yarns break during weaving. The success in identifying these breaks and fixing depends on the skill of the hand weaver. However, there are signs in the shroud sample that direct the notion of mending or reweaving of the actual woven fabric. So I'm getting near the end here. I've got there's so much to go through, and I can't do everything here. But again, for the Washington conference, I'm actually only giving a 20-minute paper, but the proceedings will allow me to expand on that, and that's where I'll have the full expanded version with all the slides and the updated information. It's also interesting to note that in my new book, I had asked Dr. Eric Jumper, who is the co-founder of STIRP, to actually just write a recommendation for the book, and he ended up writing like 2.5 or 3 pages. So I said, I'm not going to waste that. So I just made it into a special contribution, and was pleasantly pleased to find that he thinks that there is some merit to the invisible reweave. So that's another STIRP member that you know, gives that theory some credence. And then just a couple more bits before I wind up. I just found this past year, there's an Italian historian that came out with a 500-page book on the shroud. He's anti-shroud, actually. But one little bit I found that was pretty interesting was that he mentions a repair that I was unaware of, and I think everybody else in the world was probably unaware of, that took place on a very specific, he gave the date of December 18th, 1595, which was about 60 years after the fire of 1532. And I should say, Margaret of Austria died in 1530. And so Sue and I believe that the invisible reweave was actually done before the fire of 1532. So I think one of the objections Bob has about why you'd have an invisible reweave, and then also the kind of the primitive patches that the nuns put on the shroud in 1534, is that we believe the reweave was done before 1530, and then once she died, she was kind of, I guess, maybe out of the picture, and one way or the other, the nuns were allowed, who of course weren't as proficient as the weavers that Margaret of Austria had, and they put the patches on the shroud in 1534, 2 years after the fire, and that would be 4 years after Margaret died. So in this past August, Paulo Di Lozaro and 5 other physicists, chemists, and statisticians published a peer-reviewed article in which they enumerated several factors that point toward a reweave. And there's various points. The quotes are a little technical and whatnot. I won't read those. But I think there's a psychological factor. It looks like I'm missing my last slide, but that's okay. I've got quite a few experts lined up. I did a rough count of the different experts that I've quoted, and it comes to over 20. And I think if you look at the preponderance of the evidence, there's strong indication that there is a repair. And if you don't believe that there's a repair, you have to explain why all these experts basically independently have given evidence that there's evidence of a repair there. So I'm going to kind of wind up here and give it back to Dale at this point.
Awesome. Excellent presentation there. Yeah. Want to make sure that Bob gets an equal chance here. So Joe, if you want to stop sharing your screen, your slides, so we can get Bob's up. So Bob, yeah, if you want to click the share screen and bring up your slides, I'm going to turn it to Bob. Bob's going to give his opening speech responding to Joe's hypothesis about the invisible reweave. So, yeah, Bob, take it away. Do your opening. I'll be flexible and let you say everything just as I was with Joe. And then after that, we'll do the kind of an informal dialogue about Joe's hypothesis. So, yeah, take it away, Bob.
Yes, thank you. Joe's been doing research on the shroud much longer than I have. I find that a lot of these people get into shroud research and they work on it for decades. I've only been working on it here since early 2014, so 7 years. So this is, when I came into shroud research, it occurred to me that there were several different areas that I just didn't think were right. And this is one of them. I don't think that the invisible reweave is correct. I think there's a better explanation. The shroud researchers have gone through several different options as to how to explain the carbon dating to 1260 was the raw value. When that value is corrected for the change in carbon-14 in the atmosphere, then it expands to 1260 to 1390. But that's certainly not the first century. It's certainly not 230 or 33 AD, when a lot of the shroud researchers thought it would be. So that we've gradually over history, we've had various suggestions made, and the shroud researchers have worked through these in general, and they might be popular for a while, and they gradually fade away as counter evidence becomes available, and people rethink this, the issues and whatnot. One of the first suggestions to solve the carbon dating problem, that is why the shroud dated to 1260 to 1390 rather than about 30 or 33 AD, was neutron absorption. And that was suggested actually in the same issue of Nature as the carbon dating was published. But there was no way really to follow up on that suggestion until I did the nuclear analysis computer calculations in early 2014. My background's nuclear engineering. So I knew how to run the computer codes that would have to be used to do that sort of thing. So without any follow-up on that suggestion, after 1989, when that issue of Nature came out, it naturally went to other options, and the researchers have gradually sorted through the pros and the cons of these various things. So let me just go on now, and I'll just go through my slides as I have. So let's just go over, where we are on the invisible reweave. Well, who did it? It's uncertain. Where was it done? I would say it's uncertain. Why was it done? We don't really know. When was it done? Well, the general parameters here would have to date it between 1260 to 1532, but within that, we're kind of guessing at that. Maybe it was done earlier than 1530, but it's hard to know. Well, how was it done? Well, tweezers and/or needle and thread is the way that it's generally presented. But the important point is that it was done without a compound microscope, because that would be have been invented later than when it was done. So in other words, you have people working by hand just by eyesight in doing this, and I think that's an important item. So I come down here, should we be able to see it today with a compound microscope? Well, yes, of course. Has anyone seen it with a compound microscope? No. So what does invisible mean? Well, it means that a casual observer would not notice it on the front side of a thick fabric, but would probably see it on the backside, though they might probably see it on the backside because of the way that there'd be flexibility taken on the backside. But even a casual observer would probably see it on the front side of a thin fabric, such as the Shroud of Turin. So the Shroud of Turin is a thin fabric, has about the thickness of a man's t-shirt. Very hard to do some type of a patch or reweave that cannot be seen on such a thin fabric. Now, you might have noticed that on Joe's second slide, where he was showing various types of mending procedures, the bottom was labeled the invisible reweave, but it was just an array of horizontal and vertical threads that are inserted into the fabric. But the Shroud of Turin is not that at all. It's not just horizontal, and it's not a simple weave consisting of threads running horizontally and vertically. It's a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. I don't think that they could do anything that would approach a reweave that could not be seen on such a complex fabric. So what I would suggest, it's a very simple approach. Basically send a 3-to-1 herringbone weave with a reverse twist on the thread if you want. Send it to the various locations that advertise that they do invisible reweaving, and cut out a section and just ask them to reweave it and see what they turn out. And I tell you the truth, I doubt that they would even attempt it on such a complex weave as we see on the Shroud of Turin. Okay. Can a repair or reweave be seen? Well, various experts, including textile experts, have examined the area that was sampled in 1988 for the carbon dating. They looked at it in 1969, 1973, 1988, and 1999, but they've never been able to see any kind of an actual intersection between a patch and the original material. And in 1978, for example, there were 5,000 to 7,000 photos were taken in various wavelengths of light and even outside the visible light range and in various magnifications, but no repairs or reweave can be seen in those. In 2002, the backing cloth was removed for repair of the shroud, or renovation, I think was the term. So the backing cloth was removed, and that then allowed them to see both the back and the front side of the shroud. And again, they had the experts come in to examine both sides of the shroud at the 1988 sample location. And all agreed there was no evidence of a repair or reweave of the fabric. Now, regarding the invisible reweave, Dr. I don't know how to pronounce the name here, Methild Fleury Lemberg said, there is no doubt that the shroud does not contain any reweaving. Reweaving in the literal sense does not exist. In other words, in the sense that it's invisible. Well, it just doesn't exist. There's no such thing. According to her testimony, you can always see it if you had access to a good microscope. And then she also said, in any case, neither on the front nor the back of the whole cloth is the slightest hint of a mending operation, a patch or some kind of reinforcing darning to be found. Well, now, how is all this consistent with what we've heard from Joe? I think there may have been some very minor items going on. And for example, there was testimony that there was cotton fibers found. Well, really, that doesn't surprise me a bit, because after all, in 1978, when the researchers went in, they were all wearing cotton gloves in order to protect the shroud. But what that would do would be to leave cotton fibers on the cloth. Now, there was some testimony that the cotton fibers were in the threads. And really, that doesn't surprise me either, because when the loom was used to make the fabric back in what I would say would probably be the 1st century, it undoubtedly would not have been a brand new loom. It would have been had various amounts of contamination, probably of various threads. So including cotton, maybe wool, who knows what. There wouldn't be, polyester or linen or a nylon, for example, any modern threads, but you could easily have older threads have been used on the loom previously, and those would become interwoven into the thread. So you have to take that into account as well. What you actually need to look for is an actual interface where you see the new material going into the old material. Now, if they're doing a patch or a reweave of a 3-to-1 herringbone weave, what you'd have to do, it would be very complex. You'd have to create a 3-to-1 herringbone weave of cotton, and then you'd have to cut it to fit. You'd probably have to dye it or whatever. And so it couldn't be a simple just with a needle and thread sewing horizontal and vertical threads or fibers into the previous material. Because what you have here is that over the 1988 carbon dating region, it was, it was maybe 3.5, maybe 4 centimeters by a centimeter, centimeter and a half in width. But in order to shift the carbon date from about 30 or 33 AD up to 1260 at least, you would have to have a large percentage of the samples that were sent to the 3 laboratories. You'd have to have a large percent of that of new material, and it actually works out. You can calculate it. I've written a paper on this. This is my paper 23 on my website, shroudresearch.net. The title is Carbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin to 1260 to 1390. Is not explained by normal contamination. And I put the equations there. And so you can calculate what percentage would you have to have of old material versus new material to shift the carbon date from 33 AD up to 1260 AD, and the answer is 80%. Those samples would have to be 80% old, new material, dating from 1520 or 30 or so, and only 20% of the original material. So in other words, you should be able to easily see it. And in order to create the appearance of a 3-to-1 herringbone weave on the new material, you'd have to weave the new material, 100% new material, into a 3-to-1 herringbone weave, and then cut it to the section to be repaired. And then you'd have to create some kind of a weaving together at the interface, which could be seen. So that's a very complex process, and I doubt that it's possible at all. So in 2010, textile expert Rachel Freer-Waters and A.J. Timothy Jewell, who was a representative of the laboratory, examined the remainder of the sample that was carbon dated in Tucson. In other words, there were actually 2 pieces that were sent to Tucson. The smaller piece went directly into the vault, which they still have, untested, unaltered. But the larger piece, they evidently had a smaller piece left over after the sampling that was done for carbon dating, because carbon dating is a destructive process. So they were able to look at the remainder of the larger piece, which has not been consumed in the carbon dating, and they concluded, we find no evidence to contradict the idea that the sample studied was taken from the main part of the shroud, and no evidence of either coatings or dyes, and only minor contamination. Now let's go to the quad picture. On the larger picture, you can see that there are large areas that are covered in a greenish tint, so that the greenish tint is not confined just to the 1988 carbon dating area, but you will notice that the greenish tint is not continuous even in that area. And the greenish tint could result from a number of different items. It doesn't have to be from a cotton reweave. You know, you might be able to interpret it that way, but there are so many different materials that could be put onto it. I would think that they would have been putting, smearing various materials onto it, whether talc or some kind of a wax or something, in order to reinforce the areas that are near where the corners had torn off due to being held. Now, another issue I think that's very significant here is regarding the horizontal striations in the threads. Dr. John Jackson has stated that in backlighting of the shroud, there are horizontal striations or bands that can be seen in the thickness of the threads. In the backlit photos that were taken of the entire shroud in 1978, these striations are continuous, and you can see them through the sample area that was later cut from the shroud in 1988 for the carbon dating. These striations cannot be in the backing cloth because of the slight offset that can be seen at the seam that holds the side strip on. In other words, these horizontal striations are not in the backing cloth, but they're in the shroud itself. The continuity of these striations in backlighting could not be maintained by someone doing a reweave in front lighting. Absolutely impossible. Jackson has stated, quote, "We must conclude unambiguously that there has been no reweave whatsoever surrounding the radiocarbon site." Now, in 1532, a fire burnt one corner of the folded shroud. When unfolded, this created 16 burnt areas. These were patched in 1534. Some of these patches covered areas of the image, yet all 16 patches were easily detectable with easily seen stitches and use of a different fabric. I think it's unreasonable that invisible reweave would have been used for a distant corner of the shroud when 16 relatively crude patches were used much closer to and some even over the image. It seems like the technology that was available was the crude patches that can easily be seen. And then we come to the actual carbon dating. I think this is significant information. Now, in my work on carbon dating, when you're trying to explain a phenomenon in physics, the sequence is, first of all, you try and understand fully the phenomenon that's under investigation. Now, under carbon dating, there's 4 different features of carbon dating that we know to be true. We know the date at the carbon dating location. Average would be 1260 raw value. We also know the slope. The 3 different laboratories didn't agree with each other. 2 of the laboratories were statistically significant at about 2.9 or 3.0 sigma, so that they really were different values. And so that if you plot those 3 different laboratory results as a function of the distance from the bottom of the cloth, you see a definite slope to it, and I'll show you the result later. But the slope is about 36 years per centimeter. Now, if you're going with an invisible reweave concept, what you have to say is that the first feature, the 1260 date, can be explained by 80% of that sample being new material, at least 80%, and then at most 20% being the old material from 30 or 33 AD. So yes, if you have the samples be 80% new material and 20% old material, you can get it to date to 1260. The second criteria is the slope of about 36 years per centimeter. And for the invisible reweave to explain that, what you would have to say is that the fraction of new versus old material was changing across that 3 or 4 centimeter length, so that you can, as kind of a secondary hypothesis, you can hypothesize that that's true, but that's a secondary assumption, that the ratio of new to old material was changing across the length of that sample in a way that was then detected by the 3 laboratories. Now, of course, both of those can be explained by the neutron absorption hypothesis as well, and I'll go into that later. The third item that we know about the carbon dating is the range of the dates that were detected by the 3 laboratories. The 16 subsamples dated from a range of 1155 to 1410, not below 1155 and not above 1410. Now, this is an item which contradicts, I think it directly contradicts the invisible reweave concept, because with 16 subsamples from the sample area, which should be on the average 80% new material and 20% old material, you should have some of these 16 samples dating much closer to 33 AD and much closer to 1532. So, and in fact, I think you might expect some of those 16 subsamples to be dating to the 1st century. And you should have multiple samples dating in excess of 1410, but you don't. So that this 3rd aspect of carbon dating, I think, directly contradicts the invisible reweave concept. The 4th item that we know about carbon dating, as it relates to the Shroud of Turin, is the date for the Sudarium, because the Sudarium historically is related to the Shroud of Turin. The Sudarium has been dated on 2 separate occasions, close to the value of 700 AD, easily explainable under the Neutron Absorption Hypothesis, and I'll show you that later. But again, that directly contradicts, well, the invisible reweave of the shroud could not possibly explain the Sudarium's 700 AD date. So another, I think a good way for me to summarize it is this: is it credible for a reweave made in 1260 to 1532 with a needle and thread or tweezers, but without a compound microscope, to be done so perfectly that it could not be seen with a compound microscope today? My answer is no, it's not credible. And so that's my con arguments. And I realize that in any scientific endeavor, there's pro and con issues, but both of them have to be considered as to what the stronger arguments are. And I think that the carbon dating, the invisible reweave concept has been a very useful concept, even though I don't think it's correct. But I think it's been very useful to maintain interest in the shroud and to further shroud research, to persuade people that there is an alternative explanation to the carbon-14 dating, so that the carbon-14 dating to 1260 to 1390 does not mean that the shroud cannot be authentic. It still can be, because there are alternate explanations to it. So I think that's what the usefulness of the invisible reweave has been since the carbon dating was published in 1989. So that's my contribution at this point.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So yeah, at this point, I'm going to let these 2 experts kind of speak to each other and have sort of a bit of an informal dialogue for the next little bit, directly related to Joe's hypothesis of this invisible reweave, and as well Bob's counter to this case. So yeah, Joe, I'll maybe turn it to you to kind of kickstart us off with the discussion. Is there anything you want to discuss with Bob?
Yeah, Bob, could you go back to the first slide and let's go through the sequence.
Okay.
Okay. Who did it? Well, I named, Sue and I named one possible person in one of our papers. I think his last name was Van. I forget, I better not say it. Where was it done? I'd say France, with the French weavers. Why was it done? To prevent unraveling. When was it done? No argument with that. Probably, as I said before, probably right before the 1532 fire. How was it done? I've quoted some of the experts that say 16th century, weavers had the capability and talent to do it. I've got 3 manuals that talk about invisible reweave. It exists. Some people first said, oh, there's no such thing as invisible reweaving, when there's, manuals out there saying how to do it. And it was a very not well-known technique, is that one quote I gave. I think it's possible, and I think there's a lot of examples of ancient and medieval wonders that modern science can't explain. You know, you can't take the logic, well, you know, we don't understand it, so therefore it can't be. I mean, if something exists, you got to explain it, even if you don't. I mean, you got to acknowledge that it's possible, even if you don't understand how it was done.
Yes, you know, I've never seen one. I've never seen a reweave which could not be seen with the human eye, but could be seen with a compound microscope. I'd like to see an example of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's more, you know, textile experts. I wish they'd jump in and help out in that area and come up with them examples and stuff.
Yes, Joe, have you tried to get an example of this? I would think the easy way to do it would be to simply send in a sample and have the people that are doing it attempt to produce a reweave of a large area like this. 80% of the carbon dating sample would be a new material, you know, rewoven material, and only 20% of the original material, in such a way that we couldn't see it with the naked eye, though we could prove that it was there because they tell us that they did it, and because we could see it with a compound microscope.
Yeah, I haven't. I think Hugh Ferry has done something close to that, at least. I'd have to relook at his message in the Shroud Science Group archive. Well, of course, we switched formats. I'm not sure if he's done that since we switched over to Google or not, because we've lost the archive from when it was on Yahoo. But I know he's made several postings about that. As far as the statistics, back in 2000, of course, this may be a little outdated now, but we had Beta Analytic did some analysis for us, and the guy named Ronald Hatfield said that a merging of threads from about 1500 AD into a 2,000-year-old piece of linen, such that a 60-40 ratio of new material to old determined by mass would result in a C14 age of approximately AD 1210. And that actually correlates pretty closely with the mean date that Oxford came up with of 1200.
Now, was that using, you know, 2020 new material or what? Because if he's talking about material from 1520, he's just wrong. It's 80%. My equations prove it. Math doesn't lie.
Yeah, I mean that's just from 2000. So maybe he would come up with a different observation today. But
yes, you know, there's a large difference between 1520 and 2000. The percentage, I mean, he'd be guessing. I don't know where he gets 60%, unless he's just guessing. You know, because the numbers show it. It's up. You know, if you're talking about new material of from 2020, then you can get it down into the 60% range. But old material, no, it's 80.
Okay. And as far as seeing it on the back side, I didn't go into a long quote that Sue and I had in a paper from Chemistry Today, but we do address that in the paper, and people can, if they want to check my my Ancaster paper from 2019, there's a quote about that. Can you move to the next slide, please?
Well, okay. I did advance at one here. Did you want to address this?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Has anyone seen it? Yeah, again, I think the quote from our paper will address that front side, back side um, question. Go ahead, next one. 1997. Let's see, that's not ringing a bell with me. What examination was that? 97.
Yeah, I can't inform you on that. I was quoting other experts on the issue.
Okay.
I wasn't into shroud research at that point.
Okay.
I know it's been looked at multiple times to various extents. So it may not have been an extensive examination at that point.
Yeah, in 88, I might point out, I got an email from Marcel Alonso, who's on the Shroud Science Group, and he claims that Gabriel Vial, before the sample was taken, looked at the area with an optical device and determined from that that there was no repair there. But I don't think it was probably a very elaborate device. That's just my guess. But again, I would just point out to say that the chemistry of the area is also important, and I'm not sure you can see everything, especially if it is a highly evolved repair technique with just the naked eye and even some optical devices.
Yeah, see, I would expect the chemistry in that area to be a little bit different, just because of the items that I met. You know, I would think that they probably would have put on it to firm up that area after the two corners had torn off. You know, talc or wax, for example. So I think the chemistry would be different, but that wouldn't imply that there was an invisible reweave. And you know, I think that those materials probably would not have affected the carbon dating of that area either, because I think that they would have been cleaned off. So that I think the dates were accurate, that they, in doing the carbon dating, that they received the samples at the laboratory as we think, as the shroud researchers think that they received. And in spite of all of the misweighings and forgetfulness and lack of care with the whole procedure, I think they did receive the right samples, and the equipment would have determined the correct carbon dates, in spite of their lack of care in the whole process. So that's what I'm basing my work on the carbon dating on, that the measured values were actually correct in the sense that they measured the correct carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. So that I've learned that in trying to communicate regarding the carbon dating, it's important to emphasize that carbon dating is a two-step process. Step one is measuring the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio of the samples, but then the second step is that you calculate the date using that ratio on the assumption that the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio has not changed, has only changed by decay of the carbon-14. And it's that assumption that I believe is incorrect. Go ahead.
As far as the greenish color being on other spots, I do think there's a good chance that some of those other corners were probably worked on in terms of repairs, but they haven't been looked at closely to determine if there are repairs there. And there's been no experimentation like there has been in the C14 corner to be able to determine that. So yeah, I think the greenish color is at the very least an indication that corner is chemically different, and a possible indication that there's a reweave there. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, when they looked at it in 2002, after writing that 800-page book, I really questioned whether if they had found that there was evidence of a reweave. That just sounds terrible to say, but I really question whether they would have admitted it. Because, let's face it, they would have looked very, very bad. And people are concerned with those sorts of things. People lie and deceive to keep from looking bad. And I think I don't trust very much their assertion that just based on their own opinion, given what they had to lose, that there wasn't a reweave there. Next slide.
Okay.
Next one.
Yeah.
Well, I question some of her judgment because she had recommended it. She said that it didn't matter where you took the sample because it was the same everywhere. I mean, how could she have said that? Without any. I mean, that's just kind of a blanket, non-sustainable general observation. You can't know without further examination whether it's the same all over. So I have questions about her overall judgment, and I don't put much stock in her statement because of that.
Okay, next slide.
Mm-hmm. And as I said before, again, this is, Joel would have had a ton to lose if he had found that there was a repair, and I question whether he would have admitted it. I don't think he would have.
Okay, next slide.
All right, this is an area, this is something I might try to run by Eric Jumper and see what he has to say about this. I don't have enough expertise to really comment on this, but
Okay.
I might try see what Eric says about this observation.
Okay, next concept.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you've already addressed this.
Yeah, I mentioned that before.
Yeah, you've already addressed that, I think. And then the carbon dating.
Okay. As far as the subsamples, again, I think I'll throw that in with Eric as well, because I don't have a response to that at the moment. And as far as the Sudarium 700 date, that's a valid observation if your theory is correct.
Mm-hmm.
But I have questions about that. We'll get to that at a different point.
Okay. And just the credibility here, that kind of a summary statement.
Yeah. Well, again, I think, you have to explain, if there's no reweave there, why all the people that I quoted, which comes to at least 20 people, all kind of basically independently and without too much knowing what other people have said, not true in every single case, but about 20 different people are giving their observations that point to or suggest a reweave. And part of science is eliminating alternative hypotheses and theories. And I think you have to figure out or explain why 20 all pretty highly qualified people are giving observations and evidence of a reweave if there's not one there.
Yes, I don't think they necessarily were giving evidence of a reweave. They were given evidence that might suggest to some interpreters that there was a reweave. For example, if they say, well, yes, we see a cotton fiber there. Well, that doesn't mean that there's a reweave. You know, there's very good explanations for cotton being in the material. You know, when we say that the shroud is linen, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that it's absolutely 100% linen? Well, no, I don't think there's been anyone that's thoroughly looked over the shroud looking for cotton. I haven't seen any paper to that effect. It's just when people talk about the nature of the fibers, they say it's linen, because when they look at it, the majority that they see is linen. But yes, they can find cotton. I think that they could find cotton anywhere on the shroud if they looked for it.
No, some STRP members have said they looked all over the shroud and they didn't find cotton anywhere else.
Well, if that's true, then what you would say would be that on the loom, when they started their work, the initial weaving picked up some of the contamination from previous weaving with cotton, so that you might have a gradation of the amount of cotton as the weave progressed. You'd have to research that. Mm. Okay?
Yeah.
So anyway, that was, I think that's a good summary of it.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, just at this point, Bob, I'll leave it up to you. Do you have any like specific questions that you wanted to discuss based on Joe's opening case, or did you want to move on to the second topic?
Let's move on.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, at this point, Bob's going to give this opening first, and we're going slightly out of order. So before we address Bob's theory about the carbon-14, he thinks it's necessary that you understand what his mechanism for how the shroud images were formed. So yeah, on that front, Bob, I'll let you give your opening presentation on how the shroud images were formed. And yeah, we'll probably go a little bit past 4, definitely, depending on how things go. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, yes, okay. So yes, so let me just skip forward here. Okay, so how was the image formed? Now, some of you may not be familiar with that on our shroud. The shroud is a piece of cloth. It's a burial cloth, 14.5 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, approximately. Has a front and back full-size image of a naked crucified man in between the 2 scorch marks that can be seen. A lot can be said about that, but we're not going to be talking further on that issue. The image of the crucified man, we can see it because of a slight discoloration on the fibers on the threads. Now, this is a close-up of those threads, and you can see a slight discoloration here, and it's that discoloration that then, as you step back 8 or 10 feet, you can see the image of a crucified man formed by this discoloration on those fibers, and it's only the top maybe 2 or 3 layers of fibers that are discolored out of the 200 to maybe 300 fibers in a thread. So that's what we're dealing with, is how did this discoloration occur on the right fibers and the right lengths of those fibers in order to create the image of a naked crucified man. This is just amazing. Now, the important item is information. So we're going to start off here in regards to image formation. You ought to break it down into 2 different questions. Why can we see the image? And then, how was the image formed? Because we can use answers from the first question to answer the second question. So why can we see the image? Now, consider a photograph. When I pick up a photograph of my wife, why is it that I can see my wife on the photograph? Well, the answer is that I can see the image of my wife in a photograph because the information that defines her appearance is colors shades, light versus dark, shades and their positions. That's what defines her appearance to my eye. So that it's because the information that defines her appearance is encoded into the pattern of the pixels on the photographic paper. So you can see, I can see the picture of my wife on a photograph because of the information that's encoded into the pixels. It all relates to the information. It's absolutely amazing. But this item is very important, yet it's not been brought out by other shroud researchers. Now, this same concept applies to the shroud. So therefore, we can see the full-size front and back images of a crucified man on the shroud because the information that defines the appearance of a crucified man has been encoded into the pattern of the discolored fibers on the shroud. That, you know, in this top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in the threads that can be discolored. So the key is information. That's why we can see the image of the crucified man. But as soon as you understand that it's information, you know, we're not talking about mass, space, or time here, or even energy. We're talking about information which is related to the organization of matter in space and time. And it's we're in the information age now, and people are just, scientists are just starting to recognize the importance of information. So once we realize that we can see the image because of information that's on the shroud, then that can guide us in answering the question, how was the image formed? So the first item is that the information that defines the appearance of a crucified man was only inherent to the crucified body that was wrapped in the shroud. That's where the information had to come from, so that this information had to be carried, transferred, or communicated from the body to the cloth where it had to be deposited. Now, I'm going to list sometimes my papers to refer to for further information. So my website is shroudresearch.net. And so what I'm talking about now is papers 6 and 27. The previous topic, why we can see the image, is papers 5 and 26. So if I go forward now, so that once we realize that we have to find some way to transfer the information from the body to the cloth to form the image, then we have to ask the next question is, what means are there to transfer information from one location to another? And I could think of 6 different ways that information can be transferred from one location to another. Number 1 was radiation. Now, we get most of our information by radiation. If you have your eyes open right now, the scene in front of your eyes that's being communicated to you is being communicated to you by reflected photons of light that it is carrying the information of your surroundings to your eyes. The frequency of the light is carrying the color to your eyes. The number of photons is carrying the shades to your eyes. And the location that photon goes through your lens to be focused back onto the back of your eye, that information gives you the position of the colors and shades. So that all the information that defines everything in front of your eyes is communicated to your eyes by reflected photons. Now that works with the light. It can also work with particles, and we'll get into that further. The second item is waves in a medium, such as sound waves in air or water waves on the ocean. Number 3 is direct contact, like on a piano key or a keyboard with your finger touching it. That's direct contact. There's also electron flow through wires, or possibly even through the nerves in the human body. Number 5 would be diffusion of molecules, such as when you smell an open ammonia bottle, or you smell a skunk outside. That smell, by diffusion of the molecules, is communicating something to you, though not very much information. You can tell that a skunk has been in the area, but not where or how long ago. And the other item would be gravitational or electrostatic fields. Now, for example, in our area here in Richland, Washington, we have LIGO, Light Interferometry Gravity Wave Observatory. They were the first facility in the world to detect gravity waves. And we received information of two black holes combining toward each other in the waves that were sent out in the perturbations in the gravitational field. So those six different ways are the different ways to transfer information from one to the other, from one location to another location. But there's different ways to refine these options. We have to realize that on the shroud, it's a fairly good resolution image, so that therefore the information has to be fairly focused. Now, for example, sound waves, if I'm talking to a person directly in front of me, a person off to my right or left side can easily hear me because the information is being spread out so widely. So that's not being focused information. Waves in a medium like sound could not have transferred focused information that's required to the Shroud of Turin. Now that same objection also applies to number 5, diffusion of molecules, and number 6, gravitation or electrostatic field perturbations. So that information from either number 5 or 6 would spread out and thus not be focused. So therefore, the good resolution of the image on the shroud indicates that we can exclude number 2, 5, and 6. Now we also have image on the shroud where it would not have been in contact with the body. For example, the tip of the nose would have been in contact with the shroud, but as you come off the tip of the nose, right next to the nostrils would not have been in contact with the shroud, yet we see the image. So that therefore we know that the information was not being transferred by contact. It has to be some other means. So that therefore we can exclude number 3, direct contact. And easily number 4, electron flow in wires, can be excluded because there weren't a billion wires connecting the body to the cloth, of course. So once you go through this exclusion process, the only one remaining that's at least possible is number 1, radiation. And this is very interesting because radiation, whether you're talking about a photon of light or whether you're talking about a subatomic particle, it's an item at a point in space which travels in a straight line. So it's ideally, shall we say, designed to communicate information. So if we go to the next slide here. So therefore, for the shroud, radiation is the only option to transfer the required information from the body to the cloth. And why is this information required? Because it has to control the discoloration mechanism. That is the mechanism that discolors the fibers. This information has to determine which fibers are to be discolored and the length of that discoloration. Now, when we look at the shroud, we see various shades. It's monochromatic, so we don't have color information, but we do have shades from darker to lighter. For example, from the tip of the nose down the nostrils, it's from darker to lighter. But it's interesting that on the shroud, the discoloration is only one shade. In other words, what we perceive as dark shades is actually because of the number of the discolored fibers and the length of their discoloration. So that as you proceed down the nose, the number of fibers discolored would become less, and probably the length of that discoloration would become less. But the discoloration itself is always the same shade. So for the shroud, radiation is the only option to communicate the required information that's absolutely necessary to form the image of the naked crucified man on the cloth. So that radiation has accomplished two things, both of which are absolutely necessary. Radiation has deposited the energy required to discolor the fibers. In other words, the discoloration, what we'll get to later, is due to single electron bonds being changed into, double electron bonds of the carbon atoms being changed into single electron bonds, and that takes energy. So the radiation provides that energy, and it carries the information, carries or transfers or communicates. You know, communicate is a good word for information transfer. The radiation communicates the required information to control the discoloration mechanism. Now, when we talk about radiation, we shouldn't be thinking about something strange, because we live in a sea of radiation every day that we live. It would be like a fish denying the existence of water when he lives in it his entire life. We interact with radiation our entire life, not only with light that we receive and hitting our body, but radio waves, microwaves, cosmic rays coming in from outside the Earth's atmosphere. Subatomic particles go through us, neutrinos go through us. We're not even aware of all these things, but we live in a sea of radiation our entire life. Now, the radiation that we're thinking of here for causing the image would probably be charged particles and or electromagnetic radiation. Now, the and or is important because I don't want to exclude any possibilities. I don't think we can logically exclude options at this point to an extent. The examples of charged particles would be protons or electrons, just as examples. But there's like 42 different subatomic particles in the standard model of physics. So that, I don't want to exclude anything here. But I think it's charged particles. I think we can exclude neutral particles such as neutrons. We can exclude anything that's very penetrating, like neutrons or X-rays or gamma rays. For example, we can exclude those as being a significant contributor to the image formation and the fiber discoloration, because they are penetrating radiations, and so that they would not form the image just on the inside of the wrapped cloth. If they were major contributors to the image, they would also be forming an equal image on the outside of the cloth, on the outside of the wrapped configuration, or you might call it the backside of the cloth. So examples of electromagnetic radiation that we're thinking of here would be visible light, could be on the more highly energetic side would be ultraviolet. On the lower energy side would be infrared light, and any of those would be possibilities. So I don't want to just say it was only ultraviolet or only infrared. I think it was primarily charged particles, and I'll get to that as to why. Now, the method that we have to proceed with is that we need to follow the evidence where it leads without an assumption of naturalism, or without being confined by philosophy of naturalism, or by being confined by religious presuppositions. We have to try and judge this in a scientific manner, in an unbiased manner. Now, this process could be called forensic science or reverse engineering, where we take each item that we find in the characteristics of the image, and we try and determine what can explain that item. And I'll show you that as we get further into it. So the explanation of the evidence. Now, the evidence that we see on the shroud is that only the top 2 or 3 fiber layers are discolored. So what does that mean? It means that the radiation is low energy, probably less than about 0.4 MeV, million electron volts. That would be considered low energy, because Higher energy would be penetrating further into the fibers. We'd start to see a deeper penetration than two or three fibers. And it would also, if it's a higher energy, it would also be leaving damage on the linen fibers that we can look at with a microscope today. The second item is the discoloration on a fiber is less than about 0.2 micrometers or microns thick. Now, the diameter of a fiber is about 15 to 20, but this discoloration goes all the way, as far as we know, it goes all the way, typically it goes all the way around the fiber, but it's just an extremely thin surface layer on that fiber. And what that tells us is that it was an extremely brief burst of radiation. Because when Paulo de Lazaro does his experiments with ultraviolet laser, he had to use an extremely brief burst on his lasers in order to get the discoloration thickness to be less than or equal to 0.2 microns. So we can conclude that this radiation burst, that this radiation that was coming from the body, that had to be coming from the body, had to be low energy, had to exist in a burst of radiation in order to just be such a surface effect. Now the next item, the discoloration of the fibers due to change in the carbon atoms in the cellulose. The discoloration of the fibers is caused by a change in the carbon atoms in the cellulose from single electron bonds to double electron bonds. In other words, the carbon atom in the outer orbit has 4 electrons. In its normal state in the cellulose, each one of those 4 electrons would be bound to one other atom that surrounds it. And so it would vibrate in a certain way. But in the discolored fibers, it's discolored because that carbon atom is vibrating differently, because now it's only surrounded by 3 other atoms, so that 2 of the electrons have to be bound to only 1 atom. So the carbon atom is vibrating differently. So when it reflects light differently. So what we've learned here is that there has to be radiation coming from the body, has to be low energy, has to have occurred in a burst, extremely brief burst of radiation. And in that extremely brief burst of radiation, it had to be extremely intense in order to deliver an adequate amount of energy to change these electron bonds. The next thing is that we note that the image has bones on it. Now, I think this is true. Some people don't like this because of the result, the conclusion that has to be made, but I think we can see teeth, evidence of teeth below the lips. We can see the bones in the hand, backbone. There's been reports of even in the some of the cranial separations can be seen. But what this means is that the radiation not only had to be emitted from the surface of the body, but it had to be emitted from within the body, either from the bones themselves or from below the bones in the body, so that the radiation would be altered by the presence of the bones. So this is how we're doing it. We're taking each item that we see and backing out what would be required to explain that feature. So the good resolution of the image, there is a good resolution to the image on the shroud, but you have to realize that when we take a picture with a camera, we get a good high resolution image because there's the lens in the camera. Our eyes can see very good resolution because of the lens in our eye. But there weren't a billion lenses between the body and the cloth. So therefore, how do you get a good resolution image on the shroud? The answer is that the radiation had to be emitted exactly vertically collimated. That's the only way that a high resolution image could be made on the shroud. When the radiation was emitted in the body, it had to be vertically collimated, both vertically up and vertically down, because we have images both of the front and the back of the body. This would be like 1,000,000 lasers going off, inside each laser being pointed exactly vertical. Now, as that radiation is emitted vertically, it would then interact to some extent with the atoms as they go through the body, across the air, and into the linen cloth, and so that there would be a little bit of scattering, there would be a little bit of confusion in the information, just due to the radiation interacting with the atoms. And so, yes, you would have a little bit of loss of resolution, and that's exactly what we see on the shroud. So now, let's talk about possible causes of this discoloration that is so extremely thin, less than the 0.2 micrometers thick on the fiber circumference. Now, I could think of a couple different ways in which this could be achieved. One would be at the University of Michigan, in my physics class, I learned that an alternating current flowing through a wire, depending on how energetic it is and the frequency, travels on the outer edge of the wire, not traveling in the center of the wire. At the higher current flows and the higher frequencies, it travels just on the outer circumference of that conductor. And that's just due to electromagnetic effects that are going on with alternating current. It's natural. And so that my thought was that if you had an extremely high alternating current flowing through fibers are not normally considered conductors, but under extreme conditions such as this, you can't be sure what you're dealing with, and maybe you could get the currents to flow under conditions like this. But we could actually do a calculation as to the frequency and the current that would have to be exist in a fiber to produce a thickness of discoloration of that thickness, so that this current flowing just on the very thin outer circumference of the fiber would then create heating in the fiber, so the temperature would go up, which would damage the molecular structure, which would then, after it settles out, maybe over weeks, months, or years, would settle into a renewed configuration with single electron bonds changed into some double electron bonds, thus explaining the discoloration. The second explanation that would be possible would be that there could be an attack, a chemical attack from the air surrounding the fiber. So the chemical attack would be on this outer thin boundary layer by, for example, ozone. Well, what would create ozone? Well, it would be an electrical spark. An electrical spark from the fiber would create ozone. Well, an electrical spark would be very consistent with an extremely high current with an alternating current, as in the previous explanation. Third explanation would be a photochemical reaction, but this contradicts the radiation from the body. If radiation is coming from the body, it would be impinging on the fiber just on one side of the fiber, whereas now we're dealing with the discoloration all the way around the fiber. So I think we can exclude a photochemical reaction so that we have the two mechanisms to create this extremely thin discoloration layer would be a rapidly alternating electrical current in the fiber and a chemical attack by ozone, both of which could be related to an electrical spark being emitted from the fibers that were pointed toward the body, thus explaining just the top 2 or 3 fibers showing this discoloration. So that therefore the explanation of the image formation was that there was an extremely brief, intense burst of low energy, vertically collimated radiation emitted in the body that carried the energy and information to the cloth, required to form the image of a crucified man on the cloth. Most likely charged particles deposited on the cloth produced an electrical discharge from the top fibers facing the body. Now you have to realize, we're saying this just from a theoretical or hypothetical perspective, but in doing physics, you take a look at what the evidence is, you come up with a concept that explains the existing evidence, and then based on that concept or hypothesis, you then make predictions which can then be tested. And if your predictions end up to be true when tested, then the hypothesis or concept that you've come up with to explain the evidence gains credibility in science. That's how science is done. So that's what we're doing here. We're trying to come up with a concept or a hypothesis that explains all the evidence that we have available to us. So in other words, we've proposed two causes that would create the discoloration that would form the image. Now, the first one is the electrical discharge from the fibers was associated with a high alternating electric current in the fibers, which created heating of the thin outer layer, which created damage to the molecular structure in that area, which created a change from single to double electron bonds, which created fiber discoloration, which created the image. Secondly, the electrical discharge from the fibers would create ozone in the surrounding air, which would chemically attack this thin outer layer that we're talking about, which would again damage the molecular structure, which would create the change from single to double electron bonds, which would create the fiber discoloration, which would create the image. So that's paper 6 and 27 on my website. So those are two proposals, and there's a lot of experiments that can be done related to this, but we have very few people doing it.
Excellent.
So that's my talk on image formation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bob. All right. So Joe, I'm going to turn it to you to give sort of your opening statement as to what your theory is or what you make of the image formation of the shroud. And then I'll turn it over to a bit of an informal discussion between you guys. And then by the latest around 4 o'clock, I want to make sure we cover the third and final topic. So we'll probably end around 5, if that's cool with you guys, depending on how you go. So Joe, over to you and give your opening on the image formation there.
Okay. Occurred to me when Bob was talking about the million lasers and the vertical up and down collimation, that sounded very much to me like some of the things John Heller said in his 1983 book. Have you read that, Bob? I assume you have. Or?
I've read most of it.
Yeah. It seems very similar to me. And I certainly agree with the idea of a short-term burst of radiation. I know some scientists have said, like Adler and other people, they say, well, it couldn't have been a nuclear reaction of some kind, because it would not only would have destroyed the shroud, but it would have blown up Jerusalem. Well, if it's highly controlled and it's a short burst, and if God's doing it, he can he can do it as short a burst as he wants to keep from blowing up Jerusalem. So I think sometimes that's a case where some scientists get too rational about it, and it's sort of like, this is kind of an aside, but the whole coin on the eye thing. I don't quite remember where Bob is on that, but Barry Schwartz doesn't think the Pontius Pilate coin can be there because you wouldn't be able to discern the image because of the weave of the cloth and all that. And my argument is, why get too rational about what you should see on what you can see on the eye if you got an image that you can't explain in the first place? So I think you have to definitely, you know, leave things open for a supernatural explanation, although some scientists aren't comfortable with that. But when the known science and fails, you have to, you know, you have to allow for that. And that's not to say we won't, that it's science won't, the knowledge won't increase and that we'll understand things more in the future that we don't understand now. I mean, that's obvious a possibility too. But, you know, when you look at the whole combination of weird kind of strange features on the shroud, I think you certainly have to entertain the idea of a supernatural explanation, because, you know, you can't, it'd be so weird to have a million different natural events coming together simultaneously to form a natural image. I mean, it makes more sense, I think, to just be open to the possibility that God performed a miracle there. And it's staying on that idea of a short burst of radiation. I'm reminded of some of those pictures that you can see of like Hiroshima, where things that were obliterated, you could see kind of a negative image, you know, left on a wall or something. So here, you know, there you have an example of something that was there. It was incinerated, but yet a negative image was left in a short, you know, in that short time that it took for the explosion to blast that image onto a wall or whatever. So I think it's somewhat similar with the shroud, where you have you have an image being blasted onto a cloth in a very short period of time in a kind of a negative form. So my own personal, I guess, favorite as far as the type of event it might have been is I'm very partial to the Paulo di Lazzaro theory, that where they did the laser, they did on a small piece of linen, and they were able to, with a short burst of excimer laser, come up with an image that kind of fairly closely matches the shroud in terms of the coloration and the depth of the penetration, you know, 1 to 2 fibrils down into the cloth. What I like about that is that it's you know, based on an experiment. Overall, in terms of Bob's theory, one thing I guess I'm uncomfortable with is the idea that there's so many variables that are taking place, and you know, there's estimations of what side of the tomb the Sudarium of Oviedo was put on and stuff like that, and it's very much theoretical and speculative, and you'd have trouble replicating that as well. I mean, you can't obviously duplicate a resurrection in the lab, you know. So the whole, I find it somewhat of a problem that it's a bit theoretical and speculative, but you know, science is done that way. In some cases, like I know, like black holes, they had to use a lot of theoretical physics before they actually saw a black hole. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the science is beyond me, but I certainly think that a short burst of radiation of some kind would certainly be the most logical explanation for what caused the image on the shroud.
Excellent. All right, cool. So yeah, at this point, I'll let you guys have a bit of a informal dialogue, and this time, Bob, I'll let you kick things off with questions for Joe to start the discussion.
Uh, yes, thank you, Joe. It's it's nice to hear you basically agree with radiation. I think that is the leading concept for image formation. When I organized the Shroud conference here in Pasco, Washington in 2017, the last day of it was dedicated to image formation. And long after the event, I looked back at it, and every single speaker on image formation spoke from the perspective of radiation. So it seems to me like of the people that are involved in Shroud research and at least participate in the conferences, that's probably the major view. And it results from just the same considerations that I went through here. Now, of course, what I'm talking about is quite a bit more detailed than what Joe was talking about. So I was going into a lot more details on it, but it's nice to hear that he basically confirms the essence of what I was saying, the radiation, in a burst from the body. And so I think those are the essentials. Now, what I'm saying on this, I realize this is not really new. This has been said before. And same thing with my neutron absorption hypothesis. It's been said before, maybe not in the same way, not in the same detail. So that, I've spent a lot of time just thinking about the various evidences and how they fit together. It's a massive puzzle where you have to take all the pieces and you have to fit them together in order to make, to communicate the concepts that are consistent and sequential in the right order. One thing here. You said that some scientists would say that if it was radiation, due to a radiation burst, then it would have not only destroyed the cloth, but also the tomb, all Jerusalem, and probably all Israel. And so when they say that, what they're thinking in terms of is that the energy for the radiation is coming from the matter in the body of Jesus being transferred totally into energy according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. And so I've gone through that calculation. The first paper I wrote was on the disappearance of the body in the tomb. That's on my website, shroudresearch.net. Paper number 1 is on the disappearance of the body from a biblical and a theological perspective. But then paper number 2 is considering the scientific and physical aspects of the disappearance of the body. So I go through, I think, 7 or 8 different options as to how the body might have disappeared. And so I did all the calculations that if the body were to disappear in the sense that all the matter was changed into energy according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, how much energy would be created in that process? And the amount of energy I calculated was 1,000 times the largest nuclear weapon ever produced. And so, yes, it would destroy all of Jerusalem and all of Israel in the process. But that's not the right solution to the issue of how did the body disappear, because if you take the Bible seriously as talking about real events, and if the body disappeared in that sense, then you have to reassemble all the energy back into atoms and put them back into their right order and arrangement for the post-resurrection appearances. So I doubt that that's the case. So I think what we're looking at here in the disappearance of the body is merely that the body makes a transition into an alternate dimensionality. Now, you might think, well, that's too Star Trek. That's too weird to even think about. But I'm sorry, modern physics gets weird. And so that experiments in modern physics have turned out to be very unusual, very hard to explain. And a portion of the physicists called string theorists say that these experiments can only be understood if we understand that there are somewhere between 10 and 11 total dimensions. Now, in our perception, there's only 4 dimensions. There's 3 dimensions of time, x, y, and z coordinates on the coordinate axis, for example. So any location in the universe can be formed just on a x, y, z coordinate axis from the corner of the room that you're sitting in. And then the 4th dimension would be time. But if we're only aware of 4 dimensions, then there's 6 to 7 other dimensions that exist that we're not even aware of. So our reality is just a small subset of all of reality. So that when I talk about Jesus' body disappearing by a transition into an alternate dimensionality, we can't exclude it based upon physics, because physics would allow it. So, which is very interesting. So all I'm saying is that a very small amount of the total energy in the body, E equals mc squared, a very small amount of that total energy in the body was released in the transition to the alternate dimensionality. Now, in saying that, I'm saying that the body of Jesus never ceased to exist. It continued to exist in the alternate dimensionality. Now, I'm talking as a physicist about an alternate dimensionality. The layman would say, you simply use the word heaven for this concept, okay? So, I'm not really talking about something strange. It's actually, well known, but I'm just using different terminology. So that Jesus' body never ceased to exist, and then there probably would have been something related to energy, either release or uptake, when his body made the transition back into our reality at the post-resurrection appearances. So that's how we would explain things in physics terminology, so that you don't have to assume that his body exploded like a nuclear weapon to produce irradiation, or I should say radiation. Okay, Dale, would you have any questions on these concepts?
Well, I was just gonna, I was gonna ask Joe if he had questions himself, but I guess one thing that we could cover, one last thing for the image formation bit, there are differences in the cloth collapse version, whereas you don't. So I don't know, did you and Joe maybe want to have a quick discussion about that at all?
I could bring that up a bit. John Jackson, early on in his research, noticed that there was a verticality relationship between the image and the body. So that he realized that the darkness of the discoloration on the image was related to the vertical gap between the body and the cloth. So this vertical gap creates a vertical relationship. And this is very true. Think of it in these terms. Each point on the cloth has to be related to only one point vertically below it. Thinking of the top cloth, it'd be vertically below it. The bottom cloth, you think in terms of vertically above it. So each point on the cloth would have to be vertically related to only one point. Now, in my concept of information transfer, this is closely related to that, because collimated radiation would deliver information vertically to the cloth from a point vertically below it, and thus satisfy John Jackson's requirement of verticality in image formation. And the vertically oriented or collimated radiation is necessary because if you had one point, think of one point on the cloth, if you had information coming to it from multiple different points, from multiple different angles, all you would have would be chaos, and you could form no image at all. You just have a blur if you didn't have at each point on the cloth related only a single point vertically up or down relative to the cloth. So that John Jackson then did not want to create a second assumption of vertically collimated radiation. Now, he thought of that as a second assumption. I really don't. I think it's all in one assumption that you assume in the nanosecond of energy emission. It's just a characteristic of that nanosecond of energy emission from within the body. But he wanted to avoid that. And so he said, the only thing that's vertical that we know of is gravity. So he said that therefore he's going to believe in a cloth collapse concept in order to achieve this verticality, vertical relationship between each single point on the cloth has to be related to only one point vertically related to it. And so, but if you read his writing and talk to him, the problem is that immediately when the body disappears, there would be two forces involved in moving the cloth. Excuse me for the phone ringing here, I'm sorry.
Joe, just while he's answering that, what's your sort of take on the cloth collapse, just very briefly? Do you have an opinion on that, or you're just open either way, or?
Yeah, I'm open only in the sense that the science is so far beyond me. I don't, to be honest, I don't understand either one enough to be able to judge. So, and just the safe way to go is just to be open. But
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. All right, cool. Yeah, so Bob, I'll let you, if you're ready, I'll let you just finish that off in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll move to the final topic for today.
Yes. So on cloth collapse, let me continue. So he, in order to maintain a vertical relationship, he said that the top cloth has to collapse. Now, as soon as, if the body is assumed to disappear in an extremely short fraction of a second, and so when that happens, there are two forces then acting on the cloth. One would be gravity, the other would be the pressure difference. So relative to the top cloth, it would be brought down by gravity and by the pressure difference. But the problem is with the bottom cloth, gravity would not be pulling the cloth up. It would only be the pressure difference that would be pulling the cloth up. But if the pressure difference is sufficient to pull the bottom cloth up, it's also pulling the side cloths in. And there's no image on the side cloth, on the sides of the cloth. So that mechanism, a rapid movement doesn't work. So therefore, the pressure difference can't be the main cause of the movement. So then you're left with only gravity in order to avoid the side cloths moving in. But as soon as you eliminate the pressure difference to be involved in this, then you have the top cloth moving down, but you don't have the bottom cloth moving up at all. And so that there's really no out for this line of thinking. And there's actually multiple problems with this because the concept is that the cloth collapses. And I admit that the cloth will ultimately collapse after the body disappears. Just but I say it's not going to have anything to do with the image formation. And the reason is because radiation is so rapid. As soon as the body disappears, the radiation is, in my understanding and my assumptions, would be produced by the disappearance of the body. So as soon as the body disappearance is over, there's no more radiation and it's gone. It moves so rapidly that it's gone by the time that the cloth starts to collapse. Now, John Jackson spent a lot of time thinking about this, and he's produced papers on it, though I think they're wrong. But then Mark Antonacci then adopted this view from John Jackson. And so Mark Antonacci has included this concept of a cloth collapse being the cause of image formation in both of his books, published in 2000 and 2015. But I'm entirely unconvinced because of multiple reasons that I've documented in my paper number 14 on my website, shroudresearch.net. The title is Potential Problems with the Cloth Collapse Hypothesis for Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin. So in other words, what they are saying is that the cloth collapses into the region formerly occupied by the body, where it then encounters radiation, as though radiation would be static and not moving. And that's entirely untrue. So that what they're saying is the image has to fall into this previously occupied region by the body where it encounters radiation, whereas I'm saying that the radiation moves through the body, exits the body, where it then encounters the shroud in essentially its original location. So both the cloth collapse and my concept, they're both due to radiation, but there's a difference as to where it encounters the radiation and the nature of that radiation. I say the radiation is extremely rapid, whether you're talking about electromagnetic radiation moving at the speed of light, or even subatomic particles moving even at thermal energies is still extremely rapid. The cloth wouldn't even move the thickness of the cloth in the time that it would take even thermal particles to move beyond them. So cloth collapse theory just doesn't work.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. All right, cool. So at this point, I'm going to move it into the third and final section. So now the audience has got a good idea of where Bob is coming from in terms of image formation. So now the question is, okay, well, what impact would that have in terms of explaining the carbon-14 dating? And on this front, obviously, it's Bob's theory. So we'll start with Bob again to give his opening address, and then we'll go to his opening and then finish off with our informal dialogue. So yeah, take it away, Bob. Okay, so yeah, we'll let Bob go ahead with your opening statement on the carbon-14.
Yes, I'm going to explain the carbon-14 dating now from the perspective of neutron absorption. My background is nuclear engineering. I received a and then a master's degree from University of Michigan and spent 38 years in the nuclear industry, during which time I learned to run nuclear analysis computer codes for the purpose of designing nuclear reactors and doing criticality safety. I also worked for a few years in charge of a small group doing a statistical analysis of experimental measurements. So that it turns out that's an excellent background for discussing and doing research on the Shroud of Turin, believe it or not. Now, for those not familiar with the carbon dating of the shroud, I'll give a little bit of a background. If the shroud is held vertically with the front image at the bottom, then the lower left-hand corner is where they cut the samples in 1988. And this is a picture of them doing the cut of the Shroud of Turin. And if you can see here, the arrow points to where the three samples were cut from the Shroud of Turin off the foot of the front image. And then if we do an enlargement of that area, we have the cut being here with three different samples labeled A1, Z, and O. A1 was the first sample that went to Tucson, Z went to Zurich, O went to Oxford, A2 was the second sample that was then cut and sent to Oxford. And you can see there's a backing cloth above it. You can see the side strip here.
Bob, you said A2 was sent to Arizona, not Oxford, right?
I mistake. Okay, misspoke. Thank you. A2 was sent to Tucson, of course. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the carbon dating process is a two-step process. Step one is to measure the ratio of the carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the samples. And they do that because carbon-12 is stable, it doesn't decay, but carbon-14 does decay with time with a half-life of 5,730 years, which means that if you have 100 atoms of carbon-14 and you come back 5,730 years later, you would only have 50 atoms of carbon-14. And another half-life later, there'd only be 25, and then so on. It goes down half in each period of time, 5,730 years. So that the ratio then can be used as a clock. By measuring that ratio, you can determine how long it's been decaying. So that when the plant or animal dies, it's no longer taking carbon in, so that the equilibrium with the environment is no longer exists. So that it's only decaying at that point after the plant or animal dies. So after that ratio is measured, then step two is to calculate the date, assuming that ratio has only changed by decay of carbon-14. And I believe that the samples that were measured when they did the measurements in 1988 were measured correctly, but that the samples had been altered. That is, this carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratios had been altered for the three different samples, altered slightly differently because of their slightly different locations on the cloth, so that the assumption, assuming that the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio has only changed by decay of carbon-14, that ratio is false because new carbon-14 was produced by neutron absorption. That's the concept that we're talking about here. So these are the values that were obtained from Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. And you see that 3 values by Oxford, 5 by Zurich, and either 8 or 4, depending how you quote them, from Arizona, because in the paper they quoted 4, evidently combining the 8 down into a 4. But you can see the average values there: 1200.8, 1273.9, 1303.5. So you just notice the difference there. And for example, if we take the 2 extreme values, average values by Arizona and Oxford, and we just compare those, 1304 minus 1200 is 104 years difference. The uncertainty you have to combine by squaring the uncertainties and then taking the square root. So the uncertainty in that 104 years difference is 35. But then to determine whether that's reasonable or not, you divide the 104 divided by 35, and you find out that the 104 is 3 times the 35, which means that it's outside the normal allowed statistical difference. In other words, what we're saying is that the measurement from Arizona, 1303.5, is statistically different than the 1200.8 value from Oxford. And they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be statistically different because you're cutting these samples from right next to each other. So there's only maybe what, 2 centimeters, centimeter and a half, 2 centimeters difference between these two locations on the cloth. So if everywhere on the cloth is the same, then these values should be consistent with each other, but they're not. So therefore, what you conclude here is that there is a statistically significant difference in the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 based upon the location on the shroud, which is very significant conclusion. So that not only disproves the conclusion that the shroud dates to 1260 to 1390, but it also tells you something about the whole process of carbon dating being incorrect because the assumption is wrong. Now, if you plot those 3 values of carbon dating with the uncertainty, now, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Okay, thank you. So that then we have Oxford value that was measured with the 1 sigma uncertainty, the Zurich value with the 1 sigma uncertainty, and the Arizona value, Tucson value, with the 1 sigma uncertainty. Now, when they averaged these and doing the statistical analysis in 1989 and published it in the journal Nature, they assumed that all 3 values were consistent and that they could simply be averaged. So they assumed that they were all the same value. So when they averaged them, they came up with the 1260. That's the uncorrected value, the 1260 date. But you see that that black dashed line only goes through 1 point. It doesn't go through 3. So you see the red dashed line goes through all 3. So that if you just look at the data, you would say, well, the better value, the better curve is the red curve. Now, and I have a blue box here which points that out. The equation of that curve is 35.87x plus another value. So that the slope is the coefficient in front of the x value. Round that off to 36. So what that means is that this slope is about 36 years per centimeter. And if you take 36 years per centimeter times 2.54 centimeters per inch is 91 years per inch. Now what that means, if you move your sample point 1 inch, you would get a date that was 91 years difference. And if to the extent that we could extrapolate that curve out to 10 inches, then at that same rate, moving the sample point 10 inches, you change the date by 910 years. You see, so this is a very significant change, and we need to explain it. Why do the values not, why are they not consistent with each other? Why is this black dash curve not consistent with the uncertainties that are given? Okay, so the concept here is the neutron absorption hypothesis. That's how I phrase it. Or you could say neutron capture hypothesis. So if neutrons were included in the, now, so based upon what I've said on image formation, I think Joe and I agree that there was a burst of radiation from the body because we have to get the information from the body to the cloth to control the discoloration mechanism. So that, well, we don't know all the various radiations that were included in that burst of radiation. So we just say if neutrons were included in that burst of radiation that caused the image, then it logically follows that a small fraction of them would have been absorbed in the trace amounts of nitrogen-14 that is in the shroud to produce new carbon-14 atoms. And anytime you have a burst of neutrons and nitrogen there to absorb it, this is a natural product. This would naturally result. Being nitrogen-14 would absorb a neutron, then that combination would simply immediately would kick out a proton, thus changing it into carbon-14. Now that's of significance because in carbon-14, you remember, they're measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. And the assumption on part 2 of the process was that you're assuming that the carbon-14 is only changing due to decay, natural decay of the carbon-14. But now we're talking about new carbon-14 being produced by neutron absorption and nitrogen-14. So that this would cause the shroud to be carbon dated younger than its true age. And now when I first read the paper by Damon in Nature on the carbon-14, I read it in a library. At that point in my life, I had 19 years experience in calculating neutron distributions in nuclear reactors. So it occurred to me fairly rapidly what could be going on here. If there were neutrons emitted in the burst of radiation that caused the image, we should see a neutron distribution across the cloth. And based upon my experience with nuclear reactors, I had a pretty good idea what that neutron distribution would be. It would be a cosine shape that would peaked at the top, going down on either side. Shifted somewhat toward where the mass of the body was, toward the center of the body mass. And so my later calculations prove that out, and I'll show those to you. So that what I thought immediately, and this was back probably 1992, 93 or so is when I first read the paper. I realized this, that what you would expect to see if there were neutrons that were emitted uniformly from the body, that is, in the disappearance of the body, if the body was disappearing by making a transition into an alternate dimensionality, you would have every cubic centimeter within that body making that transition into an alternate dimensionality. So that if radiation is coming from the process of the body making that transition, then you would have radiation coming from every cubic centimeter of that body, because every cubic centimeter has to make that transition into the alternate dimensionality for the body to disappear. And so therefore, I thought, sitting in the library, I thought, if every cubic centimeter in that body emitted a neutron, what would be the distribution of that cloth? And based upon my experience, I knew basically what it would be. But then it occurred to me that you would see the neutron distribution would be falling off rapidly across the region that was cut for the samples that were sent to the laboratories, so that you should see a significant difference between the 3 different dates that were obtained by the library, by the laboratories. So sitting in the library in 1992 or 93, I then very excitedly then started looking through the paper itself, trying to figure out the spatial relationship of the samples that were dated by the laboratories. And it occurred to me in conclusion, when I did my analysis of the data from the paper, that the results of the laboratories were entirely consistent with the slope that I was predicting would occur over that section of the shroud. Now let's go on. Now, for example, what I'm saying here, now on the left scale, the y-axis, we have the percent of full carbon-14 content. So I'm saying this just starting at 100%. So the time between which the flax plant was cut down to make the shroud and the time that the shroud was used for Jesus' burial would probably, be a relatively short time, months or years, so that the carbon-14 wouldn't be changing much. But then it was used for Jesus' burial, and the scientists were then assuming that after the flax plant was cut down, it would then be on this curve as the carbon-14 decayed. So, but what I'm saying is that in the resurrection of Jesus, the disappearance of the body, there were other phenomenon going on, such as in the transition of the body to the alternate dimensionality that most people would call heaven. Radiation, energy and radiation was released, evidently including neutrons, so that the neutrons then were emitted. A small fraction of them, actually just about 1 in a million, were absorbed in the trace amount of nitrogen-14 on the cloth, thus increasing the carbon-14 on the cloth by about 16%. That's all you need to increase the carbon-14 by, just 16%. In a small fraction, a nanosecond, okay, a millisecond maybe at most, millisecond. So after that millisecond of neutron irradiation flooding the tomb, a small fraction of which was absorbed on the cloth, it would then go on its normal decay of half-life of 5,730 years. So the red line shows that decay. So when these samples then, 3 samples were cut from the shroud and sent to the 3 different laboratories, what they measured was about 92% of the carbon-14 that would normally be present when the plant died. And so what they did then, and that's at this point, so they just came across, horizontally across, to the intersection point with this black line, thus coming up with a date of 1260. So what I'm saying, that was simply based on a false assumption that in reality there was neutron absorption took place. They should have started from their measurement of 92% and come all the way across to this line, thus giving a date of about 30 or 33 AD. So it's all based on a false assumption that there could not possibly be any radiation, including neutrons, thus changing the carbon-14. Now, why would a person make that assumption that there could not possibly be radiation at the resurrection of Jesus? Well, primarily because they didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So all of this, I think, results from a faulty presupposition of the impossibility of resurrection. Like Jesus said, you err not knowing the scriptures or the power of God. Or like Paul said in Acts 26:8, I think, he said, why do you people think it incredible that God should raise the dead? Well, the Old Testament and New, I'm going to take off my science hat here, put my Christian believer's hat on just for a minute. The Old Testament and New Testament both clearly teach that everyone will be resurrected. Jesus was just the first example of it. Everyone's resurrected for judgment. So that after everyone is resurrected, we'll recognize that it's not unusual for Jesus to be resurrected at all. Okay, let me take my Christian believer's hat off, put my science hat back on. Now, have to keep this clear and distinct. Okay, so therefore, I took my computer code that I was experienced in nuclear analysis called MCNP. It's an acronym for Monte Carlo N particle, the N being neutron. Developed over the past 6 decades at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, verified to be accurate by comparison of calculated results with nuclear experiments, validated, verified and validated for use by the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we can do a lot of calculations with MCNP that we can't do experiments for. We can do very imaginative calculations with MCNP. And if I put the input correctly into the code, which has to be checked really for ultimate reliability, checked by another person. But if I do it correctly, and I have about 10 or 12 years experience in this at the time that I left the nuclear industry. So I should have a good idea of how to use it. But this is what I modeled in the computer code. This is my three-dimensional drawing of a tomb as I believe as it would have been designed in first century Jerusalem. There would be a doorway here. I've cut away the top of the tomb here just so that we can look in and see it. But there's a doorway to enter in, a small doorway. So you'd step into it one leg, you'd put one leg in, pull your body in, and then pull the other leg in. So it'll be a small doorway, small as possible, because the larger the door, then the larger the rock would have to be to cover it. And it gets very heavy. But then, you know, John arrived first before Peter. And when he did, he bent down outside. He had to well back from the doorway because there's no windows, there's no skylight, there's no light bulbs inside. So the only light is coming through the doorway. So he looked in well back from the doorway and he could see the body, the body cloth. And therefore, where it was located was the back bench. He would not have been able to see either side bench. But we do have a left side and a right side bench. The person doing the burial here, they bring the body in and lay him down on the back side of the cloth. The person doing the burial up the front of the pit area would then reach over and take the face cloth off. And, you know, I think it'd be very odd for him to throw it over his shoulder or something, just a very natural thing. As he's standing here at the front of the pit area, most people are right-handed. He'd probably drop it right about there, you know, 15 inches maybe below, behind, or in front of the back bench, and just a natural area to drop it. And then after he's done that, then they'd fold the top of the cloth over the body so that at the disappearance of the body, the cloth was not present on the body. And so that's why there's an image on the body cloth, but not on the face cloth. Now, there were other cloths used for tying of the feet, the knees, maybe the arms, maybe the jaw. There are other cloths in the plural that were present, but there was only one body cloth, there was one face cloth. So that in my model, this is a top view. The off-white is air, the gray is limestone. Here's the stone in front of the doorway, and my Z cut is cut at a Z height above the side benches. So it just shows the body, and it shows how I've put the cloth in kind of a box shape, just for simplicity of modeling around the body. And I modeled these with simplistic geometric figures because this is just, you know, kind of a first attempt, and eventually we'd get to a more precise modeling on this. So what I calculated now, the next one I'm going to show you is right along the center line of the body, up between the 2 feet, up through the center of the head. And when I do that, this is what I get. Now, on the y-axis, we have the carbon-14 date. Now, the sample that was taken by the 3 laboratories, remember, it was down at about 1260, down near the feet. And I've put in a figure of the body here just to help you understand where the body was located relative to the curve that I give. Now, on the x-axis, I'm showing the dimension in centimeters from the buttocks. And this is this is below the body. This is the date on the cloth below the body, along the center line of the body, from the feet at the left, up through the head over at the right. And you'll notice that this curve has quite a variation in it, because the neutron distribution shows the same shape, kind of like a shifted cosine shape, shifted toward the center of the body mass, which is kind of at the bottom of the rib cage. But you notice that the date at that point, if we could get a sample from the dorsal image, just under the bottom of the rib cage area, the prediction here is that that would date to about 8,500 AD, well into the future. How in the world could it date into the future? That's because if you're using the equations for calculating the date, you're normally assuming that you have less carbon-14 there, and so that the date would be into the past. But if you have more carbon-14, the equations would give you a date to the future, okay? So this is just a way of expressing that we would have more carbon-14 there than you would have in a plant or an animal as soon as it dies. You'd have a lot more. Okay, but you notice here in this curve that we see 2 things, that the date falls off to about 1260 at the feet. Now, that's not a surprise, because in my calculation, I had to normalize the entire calculation to something. The only thing that I could normalize it to was the average value of the 3 laboratories. So this is not any evidence of the credibility of this concept, because I normalized it to this value. But what is of interest is this slope here between those 3 values. That slope is essentially the same as we see here. In other words, the calculated slope at this point, calculated based upon an assumption that neutrons are emitted uniformly or homogeneously from within the body, creates a slope to the neutron distribution that when those neutrons are absorbed in nitrogen-14, allow me to calculate the change, the carbon-14 date that would be obtained if you took a sample there. So that the calculation then actually gives me the same slope as the experimenters determined. Now that is very significant, and it's good evidence that I'm onto something very significant. Let's go on. So if we take a cross section of the body, let's say that you take a cut through the body right here at the bottom of the rib cage, right where at the center of the body mass. This off-color area would be the cross section of the body. These volumes are where I'm calculating my dates, and I've expanded these areas to make them large enough. They were actually much thinner than that. But you notice this is the body area. Underneath the body is my 8,500 if we round it off. And then it falls off as you get a little bit further away from exactly underneath the body. Above the body, it's 4,000 and then falls off. It's higher underneath the body because neutrons, as they go through the cloth, they have an initial opportunity to create new carbon-14, but they often will reflect off of the limestone and come back through again. So they have a second opportunity to create new carbon-14 on the bottom than on the top. So that's the difference. And that's why we also have a difference on this side versus this side of the body. On this side, I'm modeling the body next to the limestone wall. So again, we have limestone returning neutrons through the cloth, possibly multiple times, to create new carbon-14. Okay, so now, so if I take, so the cloth then would be wrapped around the body like this. So if I then fold this one down, and then fold this one down, and then fold this one down, I then get this display of the data, so that you'd have the feet of the body here. This would be the section of the cloth below the body, and the head would be up here. This would be the right side of the body. This would be above the body. This would be on the left side of the body, so that we have all the data on the next figure that I calculated. Also, we have data on the left side of the bench and the right side of the bench. So we go to the next one. So we see over here where the feet would be located. This is the dorsal side of the cloth below the body. So in here would be the 1260. Actually, the 1260 is actually a smaller volume than these larger values that I'm calculating. So it's about 1260 here near where the feet were. Underneath the maximum date would be about 8,460 underneath the center of the body mass on the dorsal image. But the item of interest here is that the face cloth would not have been on any of these numbers. It would be probably on one of the side benches. It could be on the floor. I suppose that'd be possible. I didn't calculate the dates for the floor, but these are the dates for the side benches. You notice that the dates change as you get further and further from the body. You notice that. So I've indicated in yellow here 700 AD, which was the date of the Sudarium, plus or minus 50 years. So I've indicated between 650 and 750 in yellow on the left side or on the right side. And so what I find here is that a very reasonable location for the person doing the burial to have dropped the Sudarium actually gives a very reasonable, well, it gives a date in agreement with the date that was obtained by the two different laboratories that dated the Sudarium. So my point here is that neutron absorption hypothesis is the only hypothesis consistent with the four things that we know about carbon-14 dating as it applies to the shroud. You remember the process of doing physics in trying to understand a new phenomenon. You first of all, you take everything that you can understand about the phenomenon, you then develop a concept or a hypothesis that's consistent with it, and thus explaining all the evidence that you have. You then make predictions based upon that hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis. Now, it was interesting that I had done these calculations before it occurred to me that that we also knew the date of the Sudarium. In other words, I realized that we knew that the 1260 date for the samples that the laboratories dated, and that I knew the 36 year per centimeter slope, and I knew the range of the values. But when it occurred to me that we also had a fourth item to check, it was then that I prepared this and put these in yellow and whatnot, and looked at it and found that there was good agreement between the experimental values for the date of the Sudarium and what would be a very reasonable location for the person doing the burial to actually place it. You know, just kind of absent-mindedly just fold or roll it up and just drop it. Because he would have been focusing on the body itself. Okay, so the neutron absorption hypothesis certainly can be consistent with the 1260. That's determined just by how many neutrons are emitted. And I should say something about that. Based upon the computer calculations, there has to be 2 times 10 to the 18th, that's 2 followed by 18 zeros, number of neutrons emitted from the body to shift the carbon date from 33 AD to 1260 AD at that sample location. Now that number of 2 times 10 to the 18th is extremely small compared to the number of neutrons in the human body. Human body of 175 pounds, which is the estimated weight of the body of the man in the shroud, is 2 times 10 to the 28th. So 2 times 10 to the 18th is only 1 neutron in every 10 billion that would have to be emitted from the body. So that's one just perspective on it. Now, so that my calculation automatically gave the correct slope to the data. And I didn't have time to go into this, but or to prepare a slide on it. But it also gives me the correct range of the dates, which the carbon or invisible reweave theory, I think is entirely inconsistent with. The carbon dating hypothesis, I mean the neutron absorption hypothesis, it automatically falls out the correct date for a very reasonable location for the person doing the burial cloth to place the cloth on.
And just before you finish off, just for the sake of the audience, so you know the reason Bob is linking the shroud to this Sudarium of Oviedo in the first place, like why you might be wondering, why aren't they just separate things? Who cares what the date of the Sudarium is? That there is a link. You know, forensic scientists have shown that the blood patterns and some of the body fluids are a precise match in the relative positions. Just so the audience knows, is that correct, Bob and Joe?
Yes, there's a historical linkage. It's Sudarium has historical documents showing how it was, how and or when it left Jerusalem and the basics of the path that it took to get to Oviedo, Spain. And so it's been there since the 800s. So there's good historical documentation on it. It appears that the evidence on the Sudarium is very closely linked, both in the patterns of the blood on the Sudarium and the nature of the blood that's on the Sudarium is all very similar to the Shroud of Turin. So we have a good linkage. Shroud researchers consistently take that view that there is a linkage between the two.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that for the audience. So I'll let you finish off, and then I want to make sure that Joe gets a fair amount of time for his opening too.
Yeah, so the final here is just a list to my basic papers on this. I started off, now I've been in nuclear engineering. I've done a lot of work on not only doing the calculations, I'm the only one that's done these calculations. And so then it's been quite a task trying to communicate this. And so my initial papers, about 100 pages long, entirely papers 10, 11, 12, and 13. Then paper 23 was on the issue of contamination. Paper 25, I try and use a full explanation, giving 2 examples to illustrate the nature of random errors and systematic errors in experimental measurements and the importance of those type of errors in experimental measurements and how that relates to the carbon dating. And then paper 28 was a 12-page abridgment of that that was included in Gary Chang's recent book that came out on the conference papers from the 2019 Shroud Conference in Ancaster, Canada. And then paper 30 tries to eliminate all of the details by use of an analogy of an hourglass. It's only 2 pages long. So those are the various papers. If you want to pursue this further, those are the papers to look at. And that's it.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. So, Joe, I'm going to turn it straight over to you to give your opening. You know, what do you make of Bob's hypothesis here? So, yeah, go ahead and take it away.
Okay. First, I just wanted to emphasize the point about the pseudarium. You know, a lot of Shroud researchers have looked into the pseudarium, and many of them do think there is a definite link between them. And just wanted to point out that even if the 700 AD date is wrong, if they are linked, that shows that the carbon dating was wrong by 600 years. So, and I probably should also point out, this is just my personal belief, that the C14 labs didn't know a lot about the Shroud in general, but they did know that the Shroud historically surfaced around 1350. So you can be sure that the range that they came up with was going to include the 1350s. So I think there was definitely a fudge factor there based on the raw data that's come out, the Casabianca article in Archaeometry that came out in 2019 that questioned the statistics used. So just wanted to make that point. And then I kind of have a question for Bob that might be related to all this. Did you see my article about the secret C14 tests that might have been done?
Yes.
Okay. What did you think of that? I found the one part that I found pretty interesting was so background for the listeners. Back in 1993, Giovanni Rigi, who took the sample and had some leftover samples, came over to the United States and gave some of the C14 fibers to a pediatrician named Leoncio Garza Valdez. And Garza Valdez did some work on his theory, was that there was a bioplastic coating on the Shroud that skewed the dating. Not many people actually believe in that. But Garza Valdez had samples delivered to Arizona, who had been involved in the Shroud C14 dating, and University of Toronto. Now, what was interesting about the Arizona sample was that Garza Valdez did not tell them that it was from the Shroud, and Arizona dated it to 3000 BC, and Arizona dated it to 3000 BC, and Toronto dated it to 2200 BC. So there was an 800 year difference between the two. And then Adler wrote in one of his papers before he died that he said that there were some recalculations that he did, and that and I'm not sure why they had to be done. Bob can probably speak to that. But he said after recalculations, the shroud could be dated to 1st century. And I was just wondering about Bob's thoughts on that and the relation of that to his theory.
I'm sorry. I read over the paper and didn't get into that at the time, so I really can't speak to that issue. I think I should read the paper again, and then maybe you and I can interact on that afterwards. Would that be okay?
Sure, that sounds good. Otherwise, I didn't have, I have to just say I'm rather awed at Bob's numbers and expertise in all that he's doing with that. So I'm just not qualified to speak to all that, but he has certainly spent a lot of time and effort in his papers and in his slides, and I commend him for that.
Yes. So what we're trying to do now, the basic concept here all revolves around radiation, both in image formation, in shifting the carbon date, and maybe even in related to thrusting the blood off the body and onto the cloth. And so we're trying to devise experiments that can be done relative to radiation, and we're actually moving in that direction now. And so that we're hoping to have some results in the coming, maybe months and years, that hoping to get some positive results back that could then be turned over to the committee that makes recommendations to the Vatican for experiments on the shroud, in hopes that there really is an exhibition. According to rumor, we've heard that there might be an exhibition in 2025. Maybe Joe has heard more about this. And so that if there is an exhibition in 2025, that we're hoping that, like in 1978, after the 1978 exhibition, that's when they allowed the scientists to come in and do experiments. And so we would hope that in 2025, they would also allow scientists to come in and do experiments, because the equipment and the technique and the knowledge for experiments has progressed very significantly in the decades since 1978.
Yeah.
A lot of experiments can now be done that can give us a tremendous amount of additional information.
Yeah, as far as I know, 2025 is pretty well set. I think we can be fairly confident that it will happen then. And can I ask also, your paper in Washington, D.C. that you're going to present, is that are some of your findings that you're talking about here, is that going to be the subject of your paper?
Well, if we're able to obtain significant results, that's what I would report on.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's a shame you only get 20 minutes for the actual presentation, which I feel is just never enough.
Never enough. But we're doing research is difficult now because of COVID. Many of the laboratories, if not totally shut down, are on a significantly reduction in their workforce at this current time.
Yeah.
So that now there is additional research that I can additionally do with my computer code. There's a lot more that we can do calculationally related to the Shroud of Turin. And I stopped doing calculations, haven't really done any significant calculations since the first half of 2014. So it's been a long time. But during that time, I've written my 30 papers that are on the website, shroudresearch.net. And we're now trying to make progress in initiating various types of research. But I also have to get back to my calculations, because there's various things that I need to be refining the calculation that I did, as well as doing the new calculations on brand new concepts that need to be determined, so that the MCNP code can run well, it's an amazing computer code. It's the computer code where all of the knowledge of humanity related to physics of subatomic particles goes into that computer code. So it's just absolutely amazing. And so it's the result of who knows how many tens of maybe billions of dollars have gone into producing the code. But I have access to it. We can buy it for a nominal amount and utilize it for these purposes. So that it's just amazing what progress we can make, so that we could be doing calculations not just with neutrons, but protons, electrons, muons. Who knows what we can do? We're limited by the files of data that's available and what energy range they're available at. So that we have hopes of getting additional work done just computationally, which would help tremendously on that. For example, Mark Antonacci likes to talk about the image being formed by protons, but if the protons are being emitted in the body, protons, because they're charged, have a very short path length. So we don't know if the protons are emitted uniformly or homogeneously through the body. We don't know what fraction of protons would get out of the body. And that would be one of the main calculations that we'd have to do. Now, neutrons, you'd have the vast majority of them getting out of the body because they're so penetrating.
Can I sort of step in just to follow up on Joe's questions? I thought of his previous question to you about the 1973 samples, I think. So, Joe, just in the first place, are you saying that the dates that they got, if those are correct, 2200 BC or something, or I think Al Adler got it around the 1st century, are you saying that those possibly would represent falsifications of Bob's theory if they're valid, or?
Not necessarily. No, I was just wondering what he thought of the figures that were given out in relation to his theory. And it wasn't the Reyes sample that Garza Valdez gave to them. It was actually leftover C14 samples from 1988 that Rigi still had.
Okay.
Yeah, Joe, I remember thinking at the time that I didn't think that was too significant because the small size would create a very large uncertainty. I think that's what I thought at the time. So
well, even Adler said not too much stock could be put in his own observation, that even with the recalculation that it could be determined to be 1st century.
Yes.
So even he downplayed it a bit.
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to ask that because I was thinking that could be a potential way to test it if it was from a different sample or something, and we have reliable results and it doesn't fit Bob's curve or dating curve or not, kind of thing. So, all right, yeah, fair enough. No, it's just more samples from that. Yeah, cool. Any other questions you guys wanted to discuss before we wrap up, or are you guys happy that you've covered all the bases?
No questions from me.
I think we've covered a lot.
Awesome. All right, perfect. Well, yeah, with that said, I just want to say thank you guys so much for coming on board. I hope you guys have enjoyed that. I've tried to give you guys free reign. You guys are the experts, so I'll let you guys go at it and share your detailed knowledge with the audience. And on that, coming up next time, I have special guest Gary Habermas coming on to discuss his case against naturalism, part of which will be a bit on the Shroud of Turin as well. So it was actually Gary that got me interested in the Shroud to begin with. So yeah, that we'll be discussing the Shroud, NDEs, the evidence for the resurrection, and a whole host of things. So yeah, have a great week, and once again, thank you so much to Bob and Joe for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Good to be with you both.
Yes.
All right.